Chapter 1. Amelia, Sedley, and Becky Sharp leave school. It was a lovely sunny day in June 1812 when two young ladies were preparing to leave Miss Pinkerton's boarding school for the last time. Amelia Sedley was 17 and the daughter of a rich merchant. She could sing, dance, and sew, and was everybody's best friend. She smiled beautifully, though she cried easily when she saw or read something sad. Even the teachers loved her, and they were sad that she was leaving. Miss Pinkerton personally invited Amelia to her room to say goodbye and gave her a dictionary as a farewell present. Miss Pinkerton believed that receiving the dictionary was a great honor. Becky Sharp was Amelia's friend, but she was very different. She was 19. Her father was an artist who had given drawing lessons to the young ladies at Miss Pinkerton's school before he died. Her mother was a French dancer, but she had died before Becky's father. Miss Pinkerton allowed Becky to come to the school because she could help the other girls learn French. However, she did not like her and treated her badly. Miss Pinkerton's sister also gave Becky a dictionary. She had to do it secretly because she knew that Miss Pinkerton would not approve. Becky said goodbye to the teachers in French, even though she knew that Miss Pinkerton did not understand French. Amelia's father sent a carriage to pick up the two young ladies. The servants helped to carry all Amelia's boxes and cases into the carriage. Becky carried her own case. All the students stood outside the school to wave goodbye. As the carriage drove out through the gates, Becky put her hand out of the window and threw her dictionary into the garden. Miss Pinkerton's sister was very surprised and afraid, and so was Amelia. She could hardly speak, but at last she asked,
"Why did you do that, Becky? Do you think Miss Pinkerton will run after the carriage and tell me to go back to school?"
Becky replied, smiling.
"No, but I hate the school,"
cried Becky.
"I never want to see it again."
Amelia was shocked.
"Becky,"
she whispered.
"But it was fun to speak French to Miss Pinkerton,"
continued Becky.
"It makes her look so stupid because she will not admit that she can't understand it." Thank goodness for French. Vive la France! Vive Napoleon!
This was a very bad thing to say in England at that time, because England and France were not friendly with each other.
"How can you have such bad thoughts of revenge?"
asked Amelia.
"Revenge might be bad, but it is human,"
replied Becky.
"Miss Pinkerton treated me badly. Why should I treat her well?"
Emilia had no answer. Becky was small and thin. She had blonde hair and very attractive green eyes. More than one young man had fallen in love with her without even speaking to her because of the way that she looked at them. She had enjoyed living with her father and his artist friends before he died, and the school seemed to her like a prison. She did not like the teachers, and she did not like the girls. She was used to more interesting conversations with her father. The only friend she had was Amelia Sedley. She was envious of the rich girl's happiness.
"They are happy, although I am more clever,"
she thought. She studied hard and practiced her music. Miss Pinkerton heard her play the piano and asked her to teach the girls music. Becky demanded to be paid, and Miss Pinkerton had to agree. She never liked Becky after that.
"Find me a good position with a rich family, and I will be happy to leave,"
promised Becky. Miss Pinkerton thought that this was a good idea, and when she heard that a position was available with Sir Pit Crawley, she recommended Miss Sharp to the family. Since Amelia was about to leave the school and Becky was her friend, they decided to send Becky away with Amelia. She would spend a week with Amelia at her home before going to her new position with Sir Pit Crawley. Amelia was very happy when they arrived at her father's home, and everybody there was very happy to see her. They thought she looked very well and healthy. Amelia soon showed Becky all the rooms in the house and gave her some of her clothes. Amelia's brother had given her 2 shawls from India, and she gave one of them to Becky who thought they were very beautiful.
"It must be lovely to have such a kind brother,"
she said to Amelia, who knew that Becky had no brothers or sisters and no parents. Amelia laughed.
"My brother is very kind and good, but he is much older than me and doesn't speak to me often." "But he must be very rich." "Yes, he is." "I am sure that his wife must be beautiful." "No, Joseph is not married."
Amelia laughed again.
"If he is kind and rich and not married,"
thought Becky,
"why shouldn't I marry him? I will only be here for 1 or 2 weeks, but I can try."
However, she did not say anything about this to Amelia. It was her secret plan. Chapter 2. Joseph Sedley meets Becky Sharp. Joseph Sedley was a large man. He was 12 years older than his sister and had a good position in the East India Company. He had worked in India for 8 years, but was now in London for a while, where he lived like a young bachelor. He dressed in fashionable clothes and went to good restaurants and the opera. However, he was very shy, so he had few friends and was often lonely. He was reading the paper by the fire when the 2 girls came into the room. He immediately stood up and blushed. He was very nervous. Emilia laughed at him and introduced him to Becky.
"It's very cold,"
he said, and began to poke the fire to make it burn, although it was really quite warm already. His face was very red.
"He's very handsome,"
whispered Becky a little too loudly and stared at the carpet.
"Do you think so? I'll tell him,"
replied Amelia.
"No, please don't,"
said Becky, still staring at the carpet. Amelia told Joseph that the shawls were beautiful, but he was so nervous that he told them he had to go because he had a dinner appointment with his friend. Before he could leave, however, his father came in and teased him and made him stay home for dinner. Poor Joseph was very embarrassed, but he had no choice. He had heard Becky's loud whisper and was pleased, but then he worried that she was teasing him. He didn't know what to think. Mrs. Sedley had prepared curry, which Joseph enjoyed. However, Becky had never seen curry before and found it difficult to eat. Joseph offered her a chili, and she ate it. It was so hot that she had to ask for water, and everybody laughed. Becky joked about it, and everybody thought that she was a very brave girl. After dinner, Mr. Sedley warned his son that Becky was interested in him, but he would not believe it. When Becky began to sing, Joseph was so nervous that he left the house and went to the theater.
"There goes Joseph,"
said Amelia.
"Miss Sharp has frightened him away,"
said Mr. Sedley. He did not come home for 3 days. Becky never spoke about him, but became very friendly with Mrs. Sedley and laughed at all of Mr. Sedley's jokes. They thought she was a wonderful girl and invited her to stay for another week before going to her new position. When Joseph returned, she teased him about the curry.
"I didn't mean to hurt you,"
he said.
"Of course you didn't,"
she replied. She looked into his eyes and squeezed his hand. Joseph was very excited and very afraid. Mr. and Mrs. Sedley realized that Becky wanted to marry Joseph, but they were not unhappy about it.
"Somebody will marry him one day,"
said Mr. Sedley.
"Miss Sharp is as good as anybody else. It is his life, so he must please himself."
One evening, Amelia's parents went to have dinner with friends. Amelia, Becky, and Joseph planned to visit Vauxhall Gardens with George Osborne, a young man who was a friend of the family. Everybody expected George to marry Amelia one day. They couldn't go to the gardens because it rained, so they decided to stay at home and go the next evening instead. George and Amelia played music at the back of the room while Becky and Joseph chatted. It was the first time in his life that Joseph had chatted with a girl. Becky asked him a lot of questions about India, and he was happy to tell her about it. Afterwards, she sang some songs and made it clear that she was very unhappy to think about leaving her friends to go to her position with Sir Pit Crawley. Joseph fell in love with her, of course, but he was too shy to ask her to marry him. When Mr. and Mrs. Sedley returned, Joseph immediately became quiet again. He was afraid that his father would tease him. As he lay in bed that night, he thought how wonderful it would be to make Becky his wife. She was pretty, she could sing, she could speak French, and she clearly loved him. He brought Becky some flowers the next morning, and everybody expected him to ask her to marry him. He didn't.
I'll ask her tonight,
he told himself.
when we go to Vauxhall.
Chapter 3. Becky Sharp meets Sir Pit Crawley. George Osborne had a friend called Dobbin, whom he had known for many years. In fact, they went to school together. Dobbin's father was a grocer, and the other boys at the school teased and bullied him. He did not fight them, although he was taller and stronger than all of them. One day he saw a bully beating a small boy. He fought and beat the bully. Everybody was surprised when he won and began to like him. The small boy was George Osborne, and Dobbin became his best friend. He would do anything for George. George invited Dobbin to come to the gardens with Amelia, Becky, Joseph, and himself. He came to dinner and met George's friends. He was a tall, thin, clumsy man who, like George, was an army officer. They all talked about the war with France, and Joseph drank a lot of wine. He was trying to get enough courage to ask Becky the important question later that evening. Would he do it? Everybody thought he would. When they arrived at the gardens, George and Emilia went off together, and so did Joseph and Becky. Dobbin was left to carry the shawls and follow the others. Becky told Joseph that she would love to see India.
Would you?
He asked. He was about to ask a more important question, but they were interrupted by George and Amelia, who told them it was time to have some supper. They forgot all about Dobbin. During supper, Joseph drank more and more wine. He began to talk and laugh loudly. Everybody could hear him. He decided to sing a song. People shouted at him, and George was about to fight one of them when Dobbin arrived and told the people to go away.
"Dobbin,"
said George,
"look after Joseph while I take the ladies to their carriage."
Dobbin stayed with Joseph as George took the two girls to the carriage. Joseph began to cry and told Dobbin about his love for Becky and that he had broken her heart. As Becky rode in the carriage, she was sure that Joseph would ask her the next day. The next morning, Joseph did not feel well, and George teased him about the trouble he had made in the gardens. George was secretly trying to stop his future brother-in-law from marrying a girl with no money. His plan worked. Joseph was so ashamed of his behavior that he did not come to the house that day. He wrote a note to Amelia.
Please tell your friend that I am sorry. I am going to Scotland for a few months.
Everybody knew that Joseph would never have enough courage to ask Becky to marry him. It was the end, and poor Becky had to leave. Mr. Sedley gave her some money, and Amelia cried. Then they called a carriage to take her to her new position as a governess for the children of Sir Pit Crawley. Sir Pit Crawley was a baronet and a member of Parliament. He owned a large country estate called Queen's Crawley, as well as a house in London. He had many important relatives, including his brother, the Reverend Bute Crawley. His first wife was the daughter of Lord Binkie. They had two sons, Pitt and Rawdon. Many years after his wife died, Sir Pit Crawley married again and had two daughters. Becky would be their teacher. Becky had never met a baronet and imagined the fine clothes and manners that Sir Pit Crawley would have. The carriage drove to Sir Pitt's house on Great Gaunt Street in London. The door was opened by a very rough, dirty, bald old man who carried Becky's baggage into the house. Becky was surprised that the baronet would employ such a servant. She was even more surprised when she discovered that this bald old man was not a servant, but Sir Pit himself. There were other surprises. Sir Pit Crawley was a very mean man who hated to spend money. He ate cheap food that he cooked himself. His grammar and spelling were very bad. She heard him say,
"Him and his family has been cheating me."
She saw him write,
"I leave tomorrow morning, early."
None of this seemed to worry him, however. That night she slept in the bed where the First Lady Crawley had died. She had to share it with Mrs. Tinker, an old cleaning woman who awakened her at 4 o'clock the next morning. It was time to go to the Crawley country estate. Sir Pit, Mrs. Tinker, and Becky traveled on a public coach, of which Sir Pit was part owner. It rained, but Sir Pit would not let Becky sit inside the coach. She had to sit with the driver and was soon very wet and cold. At Mudbury, a village about 4 miles from the estate, they got off the public coach and used a carriage and 4 horses to drive the rest of the way. A long avenue lined with trees led to the house. Sir Pit told Becky how much timber was in the trees and what it was worth. He complained about some of the farmers who worked on his farms and about his brother Bute, who owned the next estate. He and his brother were always fighting. He saw some small boys playing on his land and told his servant to beat them. Becky did not like the house, although it was very large. It had at least 20 bedrooms on the first floor. Sir Pit's 2 daughters, Rose and Violet, who were 8 and 10 years old, soon showed Becky her bedroom and the schoolroom, which were on the second floor. Becky also met Lady Crawley, a thin, sad woman, and her stepson Pit, who was also thin and pale and ugly. He was called Mr. Crawley. His brother Rawdon was in the army and was away with his regiment. They ate mutton for dinner, and Sir Pit talked about his sheep. Mr. Crawley could not remember that Becky's surname was Sharp and called her Miss Blunt and then Miss Short. After dinner, Becky played cards with the 2 girls. Then Sir Pit came and read to them from the Bible and said prayers, which Becky did not like at all. She went to bed and was writing a letter to Amelia when Sir Pit and a servant came into the room and took away her candle.
"No candles after 11 o'clock,
explained Sir Pit.
"They cost money, you know."
Chapter 4. The Crawleys of Queen's Crawley. Sir Pit hated spending money. He tried to make his estate Queen's Crawley profitable, but because he always bought the cheapest things, they always broke, and because he would not pay his workers properly, they always left. In this way, he lost money and became poorer and poorer, so he spent even less money, and even more things went wrong. He was cunning, mean, selfish, and foolish. He loved to drink wine with farmers and joke with their daughters. Sir Pit's first wife was a daughter of Lord Binkie, who was a very rich and important man in England at that time. The parents had arranged the marriage, but Sir Pit never liked her. Their first son, Pit, would become the baronet and the member of Parliament when his father died. When he grew up, he became a very polite and proper gentleman, like his grandfather, Lord Binkie. He was a very good student in school and at the university. He later worked for his grandfather, Lord Binkie. He also worked at the British Embassy in Pumpernickel in Germany for 10 years before coming home to be a country gentleman. He dressed up for dinner and taught the servants to speak and behave properly. He was very interested in politics and religion, and loved giving long speeches about them, but he disagreed with his uncle, Reverend Bute Crawley, and went to a different church. Pitt's younger brother, Rawdon, was a very different man. He went to a university too, but did not do very well. He loved boxing, hunting, drinking, and dancing with the ladies. He soon left the university and joined the army. He rarely visited Queen's Crawley because he hated his brother. When the First Lady Crawley died, Sir Pit decided that he would marry an ordinary girl because he thought she might not argue with him as much as Lord Binky's daughter had. He married Rose Dawson, the daughter of an ironmonger in the village of Mudbury. This was not a good idea. Rose lost all her village friends, who were not good enough to come to Queen's Crawley, and none of Sir Pit's rich friends liked her either. Some of them, like Sir Huddleston Fuddleston and Sir Giles Wapshot, were angry because Sir Pit had not married one of their daughters and made them the new Lady Crawley. Rose was not happy as Lady Crawley. She and Sir Pit had 2 daughters, but Sir Pit soon lost interest in her, and she became very lonely and unhappy. Nobody took any notice of her, and she stayed in her room most of the time. Sir Pit and Reverend Bute also had a very wealthy unmarried sister who lived in a large house in London. Everybody tried to be friends with her because she was so rich, but this annoyed her. She did not like Sir Pit or Mr. Pit very much, and always said that she would leave her money to Rawdon and her brother Bute when she died. Reverend Bute was like his nephew Rawdon. He loved boxing, horse racing, hunting, fishing, dinners, and dancing. Everybody liked him because he was always happy. His wife was a clever little woman who wrote all her husband's sermons and managed the estate, while Reverend Bute enjoyed himself. Unfortunately, his enjoyments cost a lot of money, and he was always in debt. Therefore, Mrs. Bute had to be careful with money. However, she hoped that old Miss Crawley would die soon and leave Reverend Bute half of her money. Becky decided that she should make friends with the people who could help her rise to a better position in society. She was friendly with Rose and Violet, Sir Pit's 2 daughters, and allowed them to learn whatever they wanted. She was respectful and obedient to Pit, so he thought she was a very good teacher for Rose and Violet. She ignored Lady Crawley because she was not important at all, but she helped Sir Pit with his work. She read his papers and wrote his letters for him. She played cards with him and talked to him about the estate and work that needed to be done. Soon Sir Pit discussed all his business with her. He trusted her because he could see that she was clever. Mrs. Bute also saw that Becky was clever, and this worried her. Would she somehow try to get old Miss Crawley's money? She wrote to Miss Pinkerton at the boarding school.
She is a clever girl, but she comes from a bad family. Her father was an artist, and her mother was a dancer,
wrote Miss Pinkerton. Miss Crawley came to stay at Queen's Crawley at Christmas that year. Mr. Pitt immediately left for London, and Captain Rawdon Crawley came to visit. Becky liked Rawdon, and he enjoyed dancing with her. They were soon very good friends. Reverend and Mrs. Bute did not like seeing them happy together. Perhaps old Miss Crawley would leave all her money to Rawdon. Mrs. Bute had 2 sons and 4 ugly daughters, and needed as much of the money as they could get. They were even more worried when they saw that Miss Crawley liked Becky as well, and spent a lot of time talking to her.
"You must let Miss Sharp sit next to me at dinner,"
Miss Crawley told her brother.
"She is very amusing and makes me laugh."
Becky became more and more friendly with Miss Crawley and with Rawdon. Mrs. Bute became more and more worried. However, she did not fight with Becky because she knew that Miss Crawley would side with Becky, and then Reverend Bute would inherit no money at all. She invited Becky and Rawdon to visit their estate. Everybody was very friendly with everybody else, while Miss Crawley stayed on the state. Chapter 5. George buys a new shirt.
She is a pretty girl, but I don't know why George stays friendly with her.
This is what Maria Osborne, George's sister, said to her younger sister Jane about Amelia. Jane agreed. Dobbin also had 2 sisters who said the same thing. They thought that she was not good enough for the Osborne family. They were all friendly with her, but Emilia was never happy when they were visiting her. She knew that they didn't really like her. One day, Dobbin came to the Osborne house to visit George, but he was not at home.
You are at the wrong house,
laughed Maria, and pointed to the Sedley's house on the other side of the street.
That's where he is.
Dobbin smiled strangely and went away. He did not tell them that he had already been at the Sedley's house and that George had not been there. Emilia was there alone, hoping that George would come to visit her. Day after day she waited. Day after day he did not come. He was busy playing billiards with his friends in the army. A lot of people thought that the army would soon join in the war against Napoleon, and Amelia was worried that her George would have to go and fight. Perhaps he would be injured or killed. She did not like to think about it. Then the war in Europe ended, and Amelia was very happy. However, George told her that he had to travel to some other parts of England with his regiment. While he was away, he sometimes wrote her a short note. She wrote him very long letters every day. George was tired of reading these long letters and sometimes used them to light his cigars. His friends Stubble and Spoony thought he was wonderful because he could dance and drink and play sports. He was generous with his money, and everybody wanted to be his friend. Stubble and Spoony wondered who was sending all those long letters to Captain Osborne, but he would not tell them. Dobbin heard Stubble and Spoony speaking about it one day.
"She's probably an actress or singer and just wants his money,"
said Spoony.
Miss Sedley is one of the nicest young women that ever lived,
said Dobbin, annoyed.
And Lieutenant Osborne has been engaged to her for a long time.
Soon everybody in the regiment knew about it, and George was angry with Dobbin. Then he remembered that Dobbin often helped him by giving him money. He did not want to lose such a good friend. Dobbin told him that he should write to Amelia and try to make her happier. The next day, George decided to go to London and visit Amelia. He borrowed some money from Dobbin so that he could buy her a present. When he arrived in London, he saw a lovely shirt in a shop and bought it for himself. He had no money left to buy a present for Amelia.
Never mind,
he said to himself.
She doesn't care about presents. She just wants to see me.
She was indeed very happy to see him and admired his new shirt. He talked to her about his plans to retire from the army because the war in Europe had ended and was going to live somewhere in the country with her. She was very happy.
I will take you to visit your future sisters-in-law,
said George.
I have some important business in the city, but I will be back in time for dinner.
George took her to the Osborne house, and then he went into the city and played billiards with his friends. He was late for dinner. After dinner, his father talked to him about his plans. He had heard that George was spending a lot of time gambling and playing billiards with his friends. He warned him to stop gambling, and George promised that he would.
"Can't you find another girl to marry?"
asked Mr. Osborne suddenly.
But she loves me, and you arranged it many years ago with Mr. Sedley,
replied George.
"Yes, I know. Sedley was my friend once and helped me in business. Now his business does not look good. I think he has lost a lot of money. I don't want a poor man's daughter in my family."
George was not upset to hear this, and he did not tell Amelia what his father had said. He made Amelia very happy, and that night she wrote him another long letter. He read it and sighed.
Poor Amelia,
he said.
She loves me so much. This wine has given me a headache.
Chapter 6. Please Marry Me. Old Miss Crawley was sick. She left Queen's Crawley and went to her house in London, taking Becky with her. She stayed in bed and the doctors came to visit her. Her friend Miss Briggs came to see her, but Becky would not allow her to enter the bedroom. Miss Briggs, who had been Miss Crawley's companion for 23 years and hoped to get some of her money when she died, was very upset.
"Don't worry,"
said Becky.
"She wants me to nurse her. It's a lot of work, and I wish she would let you do it. I will leave as soon as she is better."
Becky went to Miss Crawley's room, and told her some jokes about Miss Briggs, which made the old woman laugh. She felt a lot better after a few days, and the doctors were surprised. However, Becky was not surprised, because she knew that Miss Crawley only felt sick because she had eaten too much at Queen's Crawley. Everybody was very worried about her when she felt sick. They all hoped that she would die, although nobody ever said so, and everybody tried to help her as much as they could. They all forgot about Lady Crawley, who was also sick. She stayed in her room, and nobody cared about her at all. Rawdon Crawley fell in love with Becky and told Mrs. Bute about it. She encouraged him to marry Becky because she thought that this would make Miss Crawley angry, and she would not leave her money to Rawdon. Then she warned him that his father, Sir Pit, also liked Becky and might marry her if Lady Crawley died. Rawdon was very worried about this. When Miss Crawley came to London with Becky, Rawdon soon followed her. He came to the house quite often, but his purpose was to visit Becky, not his old aunt. Sir Pit sent letters to the house, hoping that his sister was improving and asking her to send Becky back to him. Miss Crawley took no notice of these letters and kept Becky with her. She realized, of course, that Becky would expect some reward for her companionship. She gave her some clothes and jewels and thought that she would give her some money when she married. Perhaps she should marry one of the doctors, she thought. Then she would have a comfortable life. When Miss Crawley was feeling better, Becky sang for her and took her for drives in the carriage. They visited the Sedleys' house and met Amelia. Miss Crawley liked Emilia and told Becky to invite her to afternoon tea.
Perhaps you would like to meet her,
she said to Rawdon.
Oh, she is already engaged,
said Becky quickly.
She is going to marry Lieutenant Osborne.
This made Rawdon laugh.
I know him. He is good-looking, and he thinks that he can play billiards, but I won £200 from him. I would have won more, but his friend Captain Dobbin took him away. Everybody wins money from him, but if he does win money from you, he will pay for your dinner. His father is a businessman and is very rich.
I will warn Amelia that her future husband gambles,
said Becky.
Let's invite him to afternoon tea as well,
suggested Rawdon. Amelia and George came to afternoon tea and met Miss Crawley. Rawdon agreed that Amelia was a pretty girl. George was pleased to see Becky again and reminded her about Joseph.
I was very young and silly then,
said Becky.
I have been living with proper country gentlemen since then, and I am wiser now.
Becky spoke like this to him because she suspected that he had stopped Joseph from proposing to her. George was surprised to hear her speak like this. She was only a governess, and he was the son of a rich businessman. George was so angry that he walked away. The next day he spoke to Rawdon about her and warned him that she might try to marry him. Then he told Amelia what he had done. Amelia was upset about it because she could see that Rawdon loved Becky. Not long after this, while Becky was still in London, Lady Crawley died.
What a nuisance,
said Miss Crawley when she heard the news.
I hope he will not marry again. Pitt will be very angry if he does.
Sir Pit was in London when his lady died, and he came straight to Miss Crawley's house.
She is too sick to see you,
said Becky.
I did not come to see her. I came to see you. I want you to come back to Queen's Crawley.
I will come as soon as I can,
promised Becky.
I can't go on without you.
Sir Pit got down on his knees.
Marry me, Rebecca,
he said.
You will be the new Lady Crawley, and I will make you happy.
Becky stared at him.
Oh, Sir Pit, I can't. I am married already.
Chapter 7. Bad News for Everybody. Miss Briggs was watching through the keyhole. When she saw Sir Pit go down on his knees, she ran to tell Miss Crawley. Miss Crawley came into the room and demanded to know what was happening.
I have told Sir Pit that I cannot marry him,"
said Becky, who was crying. Miss Crawley and Miss Briggs could not believe what they heard.
"Is our family not good enough for you?"
asked Miss Crawley.
"Your family has been very kind to me, and I hope that they will remain kind."
Miss Briggs told all the servants that Sir Pit had proposed to Becky and that she had refused him. One of the servants immediately wrote to Mrs. Bute and told her the news. Nobody knew why Becky had refused to marry Sir Pit, but Miss Briggs guessed that there must be another man, and she and Miss Crawley tried to find out who it might be. However, Becky would not tell them. She wrote a letter to her secret husband and told him what had happened. She was worried that Sir Pit and Miss Crawley would be angry if she told them who had married her, but thought it might be better to tell them as soon as possible. That would give them more time to become friends again. She gave the letter to her maid and told her to bring it to Rawdon Crawley. Rawdon was pleased. He rented a house and waited. 2 nights later, Becky secretly left Miss Crawley's house. She left a note for Miss Briggs, telling her that she had married Rawdon. As Miss Briggs was reading the letter, Mrs. Bute arrived to visit Miss Crawley. Miss Briggs rushed downstairs and told her the news. When they told Miss Crawley, she was very upset. Mrs. Bute told Miss Crawley what she knew about Becky's parents. Miss Crawley fainted. They called the doctor and put her in bed. Then Sir Pit arrived, and they told him the news as well. He was very, very angry. He returned to Queen's Crawley and gave Becky's clothes to the servants. A month later, Mrs. Bute was still in the house, and Miss Crawley was still sick. Mrs. Bute told Miss Crawley as many bad things about Becky as she could.
"She is nobody,"
said Mrs. Bute. Miss Crawley was very angry that her favorite nephew Rawdon had married such a bad girl. She would not allow Rawdon to visit her and returned his letters unopened. Rawdon, however, was a happily married man because Becky knew how to make him happy. They did not have much money, but they bought lots of things on credit and lived very well. Mr. Sedley, Amelia's father, also had no money. George's father had been right. Mr. Sedley's business was bankrupt, and he had to sell his house and furniture. It was a very sad day for him and his family. They went to live in a much smaller house. Joseph, who was still very wealthy, gave his parents some money so that they would not starve. Dobbin bought Amelia a piano and sent it to her new home as a present. When Rawdon and Becky heard about the Sedleys' misfortune, they thought that George Osborne would break his engagement to Amelia Sedley. Mr. and Mrs. Sedley thought so too, and they were very sad for her because they thought she loved him. Emilia, however, was worried because George hardly ever came to visit her. Did he really love her as much as she loved him? George's father, who used to be Mr. Sedley's friend, wrote to him. It was a cruel letter.
"Our families are no longer friends,"
it said.
"We will not meet again."
Amelia read the letter and knew that George would not come to visit her again. It made her sad, but she was not surprised. She had always thought that he was too good for her. Amelia sent back all the presents that George had given her. She stayed home and helped to look after her father. Dobbin's sisters said that Amelia was a foolish girl, and Dobbin was angry with them.
Amelia is a good girl, and I think that George should still marry her.
His mother and sisters were worried that he might marry her himself, but then the war in Europe started again. Dobbin and George had to get ready to fight. Amelia wrote George a note to say goodbye and wished him good luck in the war. She thanked him for the piano. She thought that he had bought it for her, and he did not want to tell her that it was not true. Dobbin visited Amelia, who looked so sad that he thought she was dying. He told George how sad she was, and George decided to visit her, although his father had told him he must not. Chapter 8. Everybody Goes to Brighton. Mrs. Bute was worried that Miss Crawley might want to be friends with Rawdon and Becky again, and give her money to them when she died. She made a plan. She made sure that Miss Briggs and Miss Crawley's housekeeper, Mrs. Firkin, were her friends. Then she made certain that Miss Crawley did not get better. She made the doctors come twice every day, and would not let Miss Crawley get out of bed. She kept the room dark. She made everybody whisper while they were in the house. She blamed Rawdon and Becky for the illness. She watched Miss Crawley like a cat watches a mouse.
Rawdon and Becky's secret marriage has made Miss Crawley very ill,
she told everybody.
She needs me to look after her. You are very ill,
she told Miss Crawley, and Miss Crawley believed her. She told Miss Crawley all the bad things she could find out about Rawdon, and Miss Crawley believed her. She told her all the bad things she could find out about Becky, and Miss Crawley believed her. It was a good plan, but it worked too well. The doctors told her that she was making Miss Crawley sicker and sicker.
You must take her out of this dark room and make her cheerful,
they said,
or she will die.
Mrs. Bute did not want that to happen because Miss Crawley had not changed her will yet. She took the old lady for a ride in her carriage, but they saw Rawdon and Becky in the street. They refused to say hello to them, but Mrs. Bute was worried. She did not want her prisoner to see them, so she took her to Brighton for a vacation. Dobbin loved Amelia, although he would not admit it to himself. He could see that she loved George and did everything he could to make sure that George would marry her. Then she would be happy, he thought. He visited Amelia's father, but could not convince him to allow George to marry his daughter. George's father met a very rich unmarried girl called Miss Schwartz and wanted his son to marry her. He encouraged his daughters to make friends with her. He found out how much money she had and how safe it was. He told George to marry her.
I can't marry her now,
replied George.
We will be going to Belgium soon to fight Napoleon. It would be wrong to marry now.
If you marry Miss Schwartz, you can leave the army, and you will not have to go to Belgium and fight in the war,
answered his father.
If you do not marry her soon, somebody else will.
George argued with his father and said that Miss Schwartz was not as good as Amelia Sedley. His father was furious.
You are not to mention that girl's name in this house, he shouted.
You told me to love her,
shouted George.
And I do.
Then you must leave this house.
I will.
George left the house and found Dobbin. He told his friend what had happened.
I love her, Dobbin, and I will marry her tomorrow.
It rained at the wedding, but Amelia and George were happy. The only people at the wedding were Mrs. Sedley, Joseph, and Dobbin. After the wedding, when the bride and groom rode away in their carriage, Dobbin felt very sad and lonely. George and Amelia went to Brighton for a holiday, and Joseph followed them after a few days. Dobbin stayed in London. He had several tasks to do. He wanted to make sure that Joseph gave his parents enough money for them to live a better life. He wanted Mr. Sedley to be friends with his daughter and not be angry with her for marrying George. His biggest task, however, was to convince old Mr. Osborne that he should forgive his son and accept his daughter-in-law. He knew that this would be difficult. Before visiting George's father, he talked to Jane, George's older sister. She thought he was going to ask her to marry him and was surprised when he told her about George and Amelia. He convinced her that she should accept Emilia as her sister-in-law. Jane and her sister Maria agreed that it was a very romantic situation. Maria was engaged to be married to Fred Bullock, who pointed out that old Mr. Osborne would not give any money to George in his will.
He will give more money to each of you,
he said, smiling at his fiancée. Mr. Osborne could not understand why George had not come back. He must need money, he thought. Then Dobbin came to visit him.
Sir, our regiment will soon be ordered to fight in Belgium. Some people may be killed or injured. I think you should be reconciled with your son before he goes there.
That's true,
agreed Mr. Osborne.
Let him come to me. and I will shake hands with him. When he returns from the war, he will be a colonel, I'm sure, and then he can marry Miss Schwartz."
"Your son is already married to a far better person,"
said Dobbin.
"He married Amelia Sedley 5 days ago."
Mr. Osborne was so surprised that he could not speak. That night he told his wife and daughters that George was no longer his son. After dinner, he went to his room and rewrote his will. Then he wrote a letter and addressed it to Dobbin, asking him to give it to George. Dobbin took the letter with him to Brighton. Chapter 9. Dobbin brings the news. When George, Amelia, and Joseph were in Brighton, they were surprised to see Rawdon and Becky there too. The young Crawley couple had followed Miss Crawley to Brighton. They wanted to try and see her there and be friends with her again. Becky wanted to make sure that she did not change her will. She wanted Rawdon to get Miss Crawley's money if she died. When Becky saw George and Amelia, she apologized to George for being rude to him when they met last time. She said she liked him better now because he was brave enough to marry Amelia. The two couples met often in the next 10 days, and Rawdon won some money from George and Joseph by playing billiards. George and Becky often talked and laughed together, and Emilia thought that George liked Becky better than her.
"I am not good enough for him,"
she thought.
"I should never have made him marry me."
Then Dobbin arrived in Brighton.
"I have seen your father,"
he told George.
"But first I have some more important news. Our regiment has been ordered to Belgium to fight Napoleon. Major O'Dowd is our commander, and we leave next week."
All the men were very serious about the news that Dobbin had brought. Who could tell what might happen? Later, Dobbin gave George the letter from his father. George was angry with Dobbin when he read it.
"You said you would convince him to accept Emilia, but this is not good news,"
he said.
"He has given me some money, but said that I am no longer part of the family. He will not speak to me or read any letters from me. The money won't last long, and then how will I look after Emilia? If I am killed in the war, it will be even worse. She will have nothing."
"Many men could live quite comfortably on that money,"
replied Dobbin.
"I cannot. I am used to much more. I cannot change."
"Don't worry. Your father will forgive you when he reads your name in the Gazette for being a brave soldier. And if anything happens to you, I will look after any children you have."
George was not sure about his father's forgiveness, but he could not stay angry at Dobbin, and they remained friends. George showed the letter to Amelia.
"I am not worried about myself,"
he said.
"I can live without my comforts, but I feel sorry for you. I wanted you to have a better life."
Amelia did not mind being poor. She was only worried that George would be sad at the argument with his father.
"I am sure he will not stay angry with you for long,"
she said.
"Nobody can stay angry with you for long."
She was really quite happy and was looking forward to living in poverty with her husband. George did not tell her that his regiment was ordered to go to Belgium and fight in the war, but she heard the others talking about it at dinner that night. She was very frightened, and George had to admit that it was true.
"Don't worry,"
he said.
"It is not dangerous, and you will come with me. Mrs. Major O'Dowd is going with her husband as well."
I am going too,
said Becky.
"Emilia can't go,"
said Dobbin. He was thinking of the danger.
"I will go,"
exclaimed Amelia, and George smiled at her. That night Mrs. Bute left Brighton. Reverend Bute had fallen from his horse and broken his arm. She had to go home to nurse him. Everybody, including Miss Crawley, was very happy that she had gone. When Becky heard about it, she was also very pleased. The next morning she found Miss Briggs. Mrs. Bute had always prevented them from speaking to each other, but now that she was gone, Miss Briggs was not afraid to speak to her old friend.
I know that Miss Crawley is angry with me,
said Becky,
but I can never forget her, and I love her as if she were my mother.
They talked for over an hour, both of them complaining about Mrs. Bute. Then Becky went home and made her husband write a letter to Miss Crawley. She told him what to write.
Tell her that you are about to leave for Belgium and that you want to be friends with her before you leave. Tell her that you are not ashamed of your wife and you don't care about the money. You would just like to say goodbye to her before you go to war.
When Miss Crawley received the letter, she knew that Becky had told Rawdon what to write.
He can't spell and he always asks for money,
she told Miss Briggs.
This letter has no spelling mistakes and doesn't ask for money. You can tell them that I will see Rawdon, but I will not see his wife.
The next morning she saw Rawdon for a few minutes. He was nervous and soon left her. She wrote him a letter to say goodbye and sent him a small amount of money. She also wrote a letter to Becky, which told her that she needn't come back.
They are all after my money,
she told Miss Briggs. George and Amelia had already left Brighton, and now Rawdon and Becky left too. Soon they were back in London. They could not go to the house they were renting because they owed too much money to the landlord, so they had to stay at a hotel. Chapter 10. Over the Sea to War. When they arrived in London, George immediately began to spend his money. He stayed in expensive hotel rooms and had very expensive dinners. Dobbin told him he should be more careful with his money, but he said that he would not let his wife live like a poor person. Emilia wanted to visit her mother, and George ordered a carriage to take her there. She was disappointed because he went to the theater instead of going with her. George was certain that his father would give him more money one day, so the next day he sent Amelia into the city to buy whatever clothes she needed for her overseas voyage. When the soldiers in George's regiment met Amelia, they all thought that she was a very pretty girl and that Captain Osborne was a very lucky man. One of the first people to meet her was Major O'Dowd's wife. She was the daughter of an important Irish family and soon told Amelia all about herself. She was very friendly and talked a lot. Amelia could not remember half of what she said. George was proud that all the men in the regiment liked his pretty wife. Amelia thought George was more handsome than any of them.
I will always make his home a happy home,
she told herself. 2 days later, the regiment boarded a ship and sailed from Ramsgate. Everybody on board, including the ladies, shouted and cheered as they departed. Joseph was also on board, since he had decided to go with his sister and help look after her. Belgium looked very peaceful and calm when they arrived, although everybody knew that Napoleon was preparing to make war. The English army was going to stop him. Joseph was sure of it and told Amelia so.
Napoleon won't even dare to attack us,
he said.
Our regiment will be in Paris in 2 months.
Mrs. Major O'Dowd was very kind to Amelia and talked to her often about Ireland and her family. Amelia liked her. When the regiment arrived in Brussels, they enjoyed themselves by gambling, going to the theater, having fine meals, and drinking. Amelia had never been away from England before and was very happy for a few weeks as she looked at all the strange old buildings. She went to the opera and the circus and listened to the music. George told her to buy jewels and dresses, and he bought himself a beautiful new horse. George was also very happy. There were a lot of lords and ladies in Brussels, and he had more opportunity to meet them there than he did in England. He went to a dinner where he danced with Lady Blanche Thistlewood, the daughter of Lord Beatrice. They even agreed to come to his hotel for dinner, although they secretly decided that they did not need to know these people when they returned to England. This was a very expensive dinner, but Amelia was unhappy because the rich ladies stared at her and would not speak to her. She wrote to her mother about it, but her mother enjoyed telling her friends that her daughter was dining with such important people. A few days after this, General Tufto arrived in Brussels. With him came Rawdon and Becky. Dobbin, George, Amelia, Joseph, Mrs. Major O'Dowd, and Major O'Dowd were riding together in the park when they saw the general's carriage. Rawdon and Becky were riding alongside it on their horses. Becky was talking to the general. When she saw Amelia and George, She did not go to them but waved with her fingers and smiled at them. Rawdon, however, rode over to them and shook Amelia's hand. George told him about the dinner he'd had with Lord Beatrice and his wife and daughter. He was pleased to have an opportunity to show his friend what an important person he had become in Brussels. Becky amused and teased the general, and he became quite fond of her. He liked having pretty young ladies near him, especially if they made him laugh. Becky was a very pretty young lady, and she certainly knew how to make him laugh. She shone like a star. At the opera she shone so brightly that George thought she was quite wonderful, but Amelia felt stupid and ugly. However, Lord and Lady Beatrice would not speak to Becky because they knew that her father was a drawing teacher. George spent a lot of time with Rawdon and Becky. Rawdon was always pleased to see him because he won money from George. Becky began to tease George now, and George thought that she was falling in love with him. He didn't realize that Becky was only being friendly with him so that he would visit more often and play cards with Rawdon. Rawdon won a lot of money from him, but George didn't worry. He thought his luck would change, or else his father would send him some money. They all went to a ball together where Becky shone brighter than ever. All the men were around her, including George. Amelia was lonely and miserable as she sat by herself. Becky came to her and made her feel even worse. Becky left her flowers and shawl with Amelia while she danced with George. They danced together a long time while Amelia sat alone and watched. Then George came to get the flowers and shawl. Before he gave them to Becky, he put a note in the flowers. Becky saw the note and knew what it meant. She looked at him quickly. He understood the message in her eyes and became very excited. Amelia saw Dobbin. She was feeling very sad and asked him to take her home. George went to a gambling table and won some money, and then he began to drink a lot of wine.
Everything is going well for me today,
he thought. When Dobbin returned from taking Amelia home, the general spoke to him. Dobbin immediately found George and told him that the enemy had crossed the border and that their regiment was to march into battle in 3 hours. Suddenly, George wished that he had never written that note so that he could go to war with a clear conscience. He had treated his poor Amelia very badly. He should never have married her. He was not a good husband. He sat down and wrote a letter to his father, thanking him for all that he had done. Then he went to the bedroom where Amelia lay asleep and gently kissed her. A moment later, the trumpets began to blow, calling the soldiers to war. Chapter 11. Life and Death in War. When men go out to war, it is the women they leave behind who suffer first. The men are busy, but the women have time to think and make themselves afraid. Mrs. Major O'Dowd tried to sleep but could not. She read a book of boring sermons while the major led his regiment out of Brussels. Rawdon took one of the general's horses, leaving his own 2 horses with Becky in case she needed them. He was a very happy husband and did not like to leave his wife and go to war. He made a list of everything he had so that she could look after herself if he were killed. Becky was not afraid. She waved goodbye as he left. Then she put the note from George into her writing desk and went to bed, where she slept very comfortably. When she woke, it was already 10 o'clock. After her cup of coffee, she read the list that Rawdon had made and then added some things that she had hidden from him. She decided that if he was killed, she would have enough to live on for quite a few years. Dobbin had to go to the war too, but he did not have a wife to leave behind. He went to see the Osbornes and said goodbye to Joseph Sedley, who was sharing a room with his sister and her husband George.
We are going to the war, and it may happen that neither George nor I will come back, he said. Will you promise to take your sister back to England and look after her if that happens?
You don't need to tell me how to look after my sister.
Joseph was offended.
Of course not,
replied Dobbin.
I am glad that George can leave her in your hands and that you will take her safely to England if we are defeated in the battle.
We will not be defeated,
exclaimed Joseph.
Don't try to make me afraid.
As Dobbin left the room, he saw Amelia. She was white with fear, and he felt very sorry for her. He could not look at her or speak to her, but left as quickly as he could. George was eager to join the other soldiers marching to the battle. His goodbye to Amelia was very quick, and he was pleased when it was over. As the regiment passed their hotel, he looked up and smiled at her. She watched until the whole regiment had gone, and the sound of the drums had died away. Joseph was pleased that George had gone and slept even longer than Becky. When he came out of his bedroom, he asked if his sister was coming to breakfast. But Isidore, his servant, told him that Mrs. Osborne was ill. Isidore was Belgian and was certain that Napoleon would win the battle. He thought that Joseph would run away and leave a lot of clothes and jewels behind. He would take them, and was already thinking about wearing Joseph's boots and hat. All sorts of news started to come from the battlefield. Some people said that Napoleon was winning. Joseph did not believe them. Others said that the English were winning. At last he went to the gates of the city to hear the news for himself. As he was putting on his coat, Becky arrived. She wanted to be sure that Joseph would give her a seat in his carriage if they had to flee from Brussels. She reminded him of the trip to Vauxhall Gardens, when he had almost proposed to her. This was enough to make him love her again, and she knew that the seat in the carriage was hers. When Becky saw Amelia, she was shocked at how sick and pale she looked.
Are you not well?
She asked. Amelia, however, was angry with her. She remembered how Becky and George had behaved at the dance and told Becky that she was a bad woman for trying to take her husband away from her. Becky denied it, but it was no use. She left, and as she was walking back to her own apartment, she saw Mrs. Major O'Dowd and told her that Amelia was not well. Mrs. Major O'Dowd went to Amelia and sat with her. She comforted Amelia as much as she could. As they were having dinner with Joseph, they heard cannons. From the windows they could see people rushing in the streets. The cannon sounds went on until it was dark. Joseph was very frightened. He wanted to flee from Brussels immediately and take Amelia with him. However, Mrs. Major O'Dowd would not let her go.
We will wait for our husbands to return,
she said. Just then Isidore came into the room.
All the horses are gone,
he cried. Joseph was not the only one who was afraid. Everybody was trying to get away from Brussels. Then a Belgian soldier, running back from the battle, told everybody that there had been a terrible fight, and that the English regiment had all been killed. People began to scream. Poor Joseph did not know what to do. He took off his fine clothes and dressed in poor clothes. Then he ran into the street. More Belgian soldiers had returned, and they all talked about the army being defeated. Napoleon would be in the city within hours, they said. Joseph looked everywhere for a horse. He saw Lady Barracress sitting in a carriage with her daughter, but the carriage had no horses. They could not flee. Becky also saw them and decided to take her revenge. Lady Barracress sent a maid to ask if she could buy Becky's horses. Becky sent her back. Lady Barracress sent her husband. Becky sent him back. Lady Barracress then had to come herself, but still Becky refused to sell the horses to her. She went back and sat in the carriage while her husband continued his search for horses. Then Becky saw Joseph and sold her horses to him for an enormous amount of money. Becky herself had thought about running away, but had decided that she would stay.
What can the French do to me?
She thought.
If Rawdon is killed, then I will have enough money to live a comfortable life in Paris.
Several hours later, none of the enemy had appeared in Brussels yet. Other soldiers returned, saying that the battle was not lost yet. Then, as Joseph was preparing to leave, without his sister, an official messenger came to say that the battle had been won, and the French army had fled. Carts carrying wounded soldiers began to arrive, and one of the soldiers told Amelia and Mrs. Major O'Dowd that their husbands were alive. Both women were very happy and made themselves busy caring for the wounded soldiers. Lady Barracris found some horses somehow, and she and her family left Brussels. Many others were also leaving. They did not believe that the fighting was finished. Joseph kept his horses ready. Becky sewed her jewels into her clothes. The next morning they heard the cannons again, louder and nearer. Joseph tried to make Amelia leave with him, but she would not go.
"Goodbye, then,"
he shouted. Isidore brought him the horses, and he was soon galloping out of Brussels. The cannons roared all day as the French and English armies fought. The English army won, although many soldiers were killed. One of them was George Osborne. Chapter 12. Miss Crawley Makes a Decision. While the war continued, old Miss Crawley stayed in Brighton and read about it in the papers. She read that Rawdon Crawley had been very brave and was now a colonel. Miss Briggs pointed out that he had brought honor to the family name, but Miss Crawley said he had brought shame.
"It's a pity he married the drawing teacher's daughter,"
she said,
"because he would have been rich with my money one day, but now he will always be poor."
She received a letter from Rawdon, and although she knew it was written by Becky, she encouraged him to write more letters to her as he followed the army to Paris. Mrs. Bute was very worried when she read about Rawdon's promotion. Would Miss Crawley change her mind about him and be friends with him again? She sent a letter to Miss Crawley and said that she would return to look after the old lady, but Miss Crawley did not want her to return. She told Miss Briggs to write Mrs. Bute and tell her that she was much better and did not need anybody to nurse her. Old Sir Pit, meanwhile, behaved very badly after Becky married Rawdon. He drank with the farmers and spent a lot of time with the butler's daughter. Everybody was afraid that he would marry her. His son, Mr. Pit, was ashamed of him. The younger Pit often went to Brighton to visit his friend, Lady Jane Sheepshanks, who lived there with her sisters and mother, the Countess Southton. Her older sister, Lady Emily, was a very serious religious woman, but Lady Jane was gentle and quiet, and did whatever her mother and sister told her to do. Mr. Pit was very clever. He realized that Miss Crawley was angry with Rawdon and did not like Mrs. Bute. Perhaps this was his opportunity to make friends with her, so that she would leave her money to him instead of to them. He told Lady Jane and her mother how rich Miss Crawley was, and that she was so old that she might die soon. They decided to be friendly to her, and immediately arranged to visit her. Miss Crawley was bored in Brighton, and she was pleased to have somebody visit her. She thought that Lady Southton talked too much, but she liked the quiet little Lady Jane, and invited her to come to the house often. They frequently went driving together in Miss Crawley's carriage, and became good friends. Pit Crawley was very pleased that his old aunt liked his friend so much. Mrs. Bute, of course, knew what was happening, but she could not stop it. If only Miss Crawley would invite her to come back.
"Why did you break your arm, you foolish man?"
she said to her husband. The Reverend Bute Crawley did not worry about this. He suggested another plan.
"Why don't you send our son James down there to see if he can do any good? He's had a couple of years at Oxford, and she may like him."
Mrs. Bute did not think he would do very well, but she agreed to send him to Brighton. She could not send her daughters because they were ugly and could not sing, and Miss Crawley would not like them at all. A few days later, young James arrived in Brighton. He was young and nervous, and when he arrived at Miss Crawley's house, Mr. Pit was there. Miss Crawley decided to tease Pit and invited James to stay in the house. Pit had never been invited to stay in the house. She called the butler.
"Mr. Bowles, please go and get James's things from his hotel and pay his bill. He will stay with us tonight."
Which hotel?
asked Mr. Bowles. Poor James was very embarrassed.
I had better get the things myself,
he said with a red face. Miss Crawley stared at him, and he knew that he had to tell her.
Tom Cribb's Arms,
he said. and Miss Crawley began to laugh. Even the butler laughed, but Pitt only smiled. Tom Cribb's Arms was the cheapest and worst hotel in Brighton, where boxing matches were held. After dinner, Mr. Pitt encouraged young James to drink as much wine as he could, and he was soon drunk. When the ladies came in, he was too shy to speak to them and almost fell asleep in his chair. Finally, he went to bed. The next morning, he wrote to his mother and told her how Miss Crawley had invited him to stay in her house. He knew that this would please his mother. However, he was not happy for very long. He had forgotten that he had bought drinks for all the men at Tom Cribb's Arms, so that his bill included 18 glasses of wine. Mr. Bowles paid the bill and showed it to Miss Briggs, who told Miss Crawley about it. She couldn't believe how much wine he drank. That night, when he had gone to bed, he decided to smoke his pipe. Mr. Bowles smelled the pipe and rushed in to stop him.
"Miss Crawley hates smoking,"
he exclaimed. He put out his pipe, but it was too late. Miss Crawley had smelled the tobacco. The next morning, Miss Briggs told him that Miss Crawley was ill because of the pipe, and that she would not be able to see him before he returned to Tom Cribb's Arms, where she felt sure he would be more comfortable. That was the end of James's attempt to win the inheritance for his parents. While all this was happening, Becky and Rawdon were in Paris, where Becky was very successful in making friends with all the rich and famous people in that city. She could speak French very well. She was related to the rich Miss Crawley, and she was pretty and charming. Everybody thought she was wonderful and invited her to all the important dinners, dances, and parties. One of the ladies wrote to Miss Crawley praising Becky and telling Miss Crawley that Becky was now expecting a baby. This letter made Miss Crawley very angry. How did the daughter of a drawing teacher dare to be the mother of a Crawley? She wrote an angry reply, but the lady could not read English, so she told Becky that Miss Crawley had written a nice letter about her. Becky began to hope that Rawdon's old aunt would welcome them back to her house one day. Then her son was born. When Miss Crawley read about this, she was so angry that she demanded that Pitt should marry Lady Jane immediately, telling them that she would change her will and leave them all her money. Pitt and Lady Jane were very pleased. Chapter 13. Good Friends and Bad Friends. Old Mr. Osborne was very upset when he heard that his son had been killed in the war. Now neither of them would ever be able to say they were sorry. He was very angry about it, but would not speak to anybody about it. About 3 weeks later, Dobbin's father visited Mr. Osborne and gave him George's letter.
"My son sent it to me and asked me to give it to you," he explained.
Mr. Osborne stared at him and would not speak to him, so he left the letter on a table and left. It was the letter written on the day that George went into battle and died. It asked him to look after Emilia if he died, and thanked him for all that he had given his son. However, he did not apologize. Mr. Osborne would still not speak about him, but he did put a memorial in the church. His daughters wondered if he would forgive Emilia. A few weeks later, Mr. Osborne went to Brussels. He found a soldier who knew his son. This soldier told Mr. Osborne that George was a very brave officer. He also told him that Emilia was still in Brussels and had been very sick for 6 weeks after the battle. He visited the place where his son was killed and was buried, but he would not go to see Emilia. As he drove back into Brussels, he saw Amelia and Mrs. Major O'Dowd in a carriage. Emilia was staring into the air and did not see him. Dobbin was riding next to them, and he called out to Mr. Osborne, saying he had a message from his son.
"Amelia will be a mother soon,"
he told the old man.
"And George has left very little money for her or the child. Will you forgive George and look after his wife and child?"
"It is not my problem if George has already spent all the money I gave him. I do not know the woman you call his wife. I will never speak to her.
It is not possible to describe how badly Amelia suffered for the next few months. Dobbin brought her back to England, but it was not until her son was born that she smiled again. She called him George, of course, and her only thoughts were about him. She spent all day and all night caring for the baby and thinking about his needs. Captain Dobbin had become Major Dobbin and visited Amelia almost every day. He loved her, but he could see that there was no room for him in her life. One day, he arrived at the house carrying a large number of gifts for little George. He told Amelia that he was going away and would not return for a long time. She thanked him for his presents and said goodbye. She even kissed him on the cheek, but she did not know that he loved her. Rawdon and Becky lived in Paris, using the money that Becky got from Joseph for her horses. Rawdon left the army and spent his time playing billiards and cards. He was very good at these games and won a lot of money, although the games often led to arguments. Becky saw that they were still spending more money than Rawdon was winning. She began to be unhappy with this way of life and wanted to go back to England. When they heard that Miss Crawley was dying, they returned to London as soon as they could, leaving many debts behind them. When Miss Crawley died, they soon found out that she had made Pitt her heir and that Rawdon had inherited nothing. Rawdon was angry, but Becky was calm.
Being angry will not help,
she said,
because we cannot change what has happened. We must do the best we can with what we have, and that means that we should be friends with Sir Pit and his family.
They rented a small but comfortable house in a fashionable part of the city. The house belonged to a man called Mr. Raggles, who had been Miss Crawley's butler many years ago. He had saved his money and bought a shop which had done very well. He had bought this house but continued to live in his shop. He was very proud of his house, and he used the rent to send his children to good schools. He was very fond of the Crawley family and was very happy to lease his house to Rawdon and Becky. He even acted as their butler when they had guests. Mr. Raggles had to pay taxes and interest on some money he had borrowed to buy the house. He also had all the normal costs of living and had to pay them, including the school fees for his children. Rawdon and Becky, however, did not pay him any rent. They did not pay the servants or the tradesmen or the grocer either. They often had parties and dinners where they served the best food and wine. They lived very comfortably but very cheaply. They could do this because their name was Crawley, and everybody knew that the Crawleys were wealthy. They all believed that Rawdon would pay his bills one day. Some people, of course, would not be friends with Colonel and Mrs. Crawley. Lady Bearcrest saw Becky at the opera one evening, but pretended not to recognize her. Rawdon was angry about this, but Becky told him that his anger would not help them.
Remember when we heard that Miss Crawley had left all her money to your brother? You were very angry then, and you were going to tell everybody about the terrible injustice of it. I stopped you, because people would not lend us any more money if they knew that you inherited nothing from your aunt.
Rawdon had to agree that this was true. He kept very quiet about the loss of his inheritance, and even wrote friendly letters to his brother. Reverend Bute Crawley, on the other hand, was very disappointed with his small share of the inheritance and fought with Pitt all the time. Lady Jane and Pitt were surprised and very pleased with Rawdon's letters. Rawdon continued to gamble and often had gentlemen come to his house to play cards with him. Becky always made sure that they had good coffee and food. One of the card players was a very rich and important man called Lord Steyne. He was so rich and important that he sometimes dined with the royal family. He was a short old man with a bald head, but Becky liked talking to him, and he liked talking to Becky. Lord Steyne owned a very grand house in London called Gaunt House. It was so large that it was almost a palace. He also had castles and palaces in other parts of England and Wales. His family and his wife's family had very long and famous histories, full of earls and counts and lords. Lord Steyne did not treat his wife very well. He preferred to be away from her and spent his time with his wealthy friends and pretty young ladies like Becky. Rawdon loved his son, little Rawdon, and spent some time with him every morning. Becky, on the other hand, had no time for her son at all. She did not like him and left him to the maids and nurses and hardly ever saw him. She did not go to bed until very late and was never awake before noon. She visited her son's room once or twice a week, dressed in her beautiful clothes. Little Rawdon was afraid of her, but enjoyed going out with his father in the mornings while she was still asleep. They were in the park one morning when they saw an old man with a boy of about the same age as little Rawdon. It was old Mr. Sedley and his grandson George. Little George and little Rawdon played together for a while Rawdon and Mr. Sedley watched. Chapter 14. Life as a Widow. Joseph Sedley, after he fled from Brussels, soon went back to India, where he told everybody that he had been at the famous Battle of Waterloo. He did not tell them that he ran away from it. He sent his parents some money every year. Old Mr. Sedley tried to start up other businesses, but they all failed. He became a very sad and lonely old man. He told his neighbors that his son was rich and that he was once rich himself. He took his grandson to the park every Sunday and told him all about his brave father who had died in the war. Emilia and her mother argued about little George. Amelia was angry when Mrs. Sedley gave him some medicine without telling her about it first. She called her mother some bad names, and her mother would not forgive her. They did not speak to each other for weeks, and Mrs. Sedley refused to help look after George or even touch him. Amelia loved her little son, especially because he looked just like his father and would not let anyone help her with him. Emilia was still young and pretty, and her quiet, gentle ways made her attractive to all the men who met her. The young doctor who gave George medicine, the French teacher who lived across the road, and the young minister of the local church all fell in love with her and helped her in many ways. The minister asked her to marry him, but of course she refused. She spent all her time teaching George to read, write, draw, and sing. If she was not busy with him, she helped her father by writing and sending letters for his businesses. Major Dobbin was now in India with his regiment and tried to help by buying things from Mr. Sedley's businesses. He bought some wine from him, but everybody said it was very bad wine. Amelia wrote to Dobbin about little George 2 or 3 times each year. She did not know that he had paid many of her bills, as well as the costs of bringing her back to England. He continued to send gifts for Amelia, her mother, and George.
Joseph never sends us gifts like these,
her mother would say, and thought that Amelia should marry Major Dobbin.
It is clear that he loves her,
she told her neighbors. When George was 6 years old, Major Dobbin sent a tailor to the house to make clothes for him, and then he helped to pay for his education. Sometimes Major Dobbin's sisters would take George and Amelia for a drive in their carriage. On one of those drives, they told Amelia that they thought Major Dobbin would soon marry Glorvina O'Dowd, Sir Michael O'Dowd's sister, who had just arrived in India to be with her brother. Amelia cried but said that she was very happy. Another person who was pretending to be happy was Mrs. Pit Crawley. Her husband had received a very small part of Miss Crawley's money, but they had paid their debts, and Mrs. Pit worked very hard to make her 4 ugly daughters look richer than they were, so that they could get husbands. Sir Pit, meanwhile, became worse as he grew older. He began to cut down the trees at Queen's Crawley and sell the wood. The gardens were full of weeds, and the house smelled like tobacco. He never had visitors. Miss Horrocks, the butler's daughter, ruled the house. She dismissed all the servants that she didn't like. She sold the horses and bought clothes for herself. Sir Pit did not care what she did. All his friends refused to talk to him, but he laughed at them. Miss Horrocks made herself the head housekeeper and told the other servants to call her Madam. One of the young maids even called her My Lady, and nobody stopped her. One night, half an hour after Sir Pit had gone to bed, the house became very busy, and a boy on a pony galloped to the doctor's house in Mudbury. Less than an hour later, Mrs. Bute Crawley, her husband, and her son James were at the house. They found Miss Horrocks trying to open the locked cupboard, where Sir Pit kept the jewels, and stopped her. Mrs. Bute told her she would be hanged for trying to steal the jewels, and Miss Horrocks was very frightened. She and her father left the house early the next morning and never returned. Sir Pit was very sick, but he lived for many months after this, although he could not speak. Mr. Pit, Lady Jane, and her mother, Lady Southton, came to Queen's Crawley to look after the estate. Pit worked very hard and began to fix all the problems that his father had made. Mr. Pit was now 64 years old and had 2 children, Matilda and Pit. Master Pit was a weak boy who was often sick, and his mother worried about him a lot. At last Sir Pit died, and Mr. Pit became the new Sir Pit. He had a seat in Parliament and was head of Queen's Crawley at last. He used the money he inherited from his aunt to fix more things on Queen's Crawley. He also invited his brother Rawdon and Becky to come to the funeral. He wanted to be kind to his family and relatives and make the people around the estate respect the Crawley family again. Becky was very pleased to receive the invitation to the funeral and bought some black dresses at once. Miss Briggs, who had become her companion after Miss Crawley died, helped her. Becky told Lord Steyne that Sir Pit was dead, and she told Mr. Raggles that he would soon receive some money. Rawdon wanted to take his son to Queen's Crawley, but Becky would not let him.
Miss Briggs can look after him while we are away,
she said. Chapter 15. Life in Queen's Crawley, London, and India. When they arrived at Queen's Crawley, Becky pretended to be very interested in the 2 daughters she used to teach and Lady Jane's 2 children. It did not take her long to make sure that Lady Jane was her friend. Then she made sure that Lady Southton was also her friend by talking to her about religion and asking her advice about medicine. She was also very polite to the new Sir Pit, and even praised Mrs. Bute for encouraging her to marry Rawdon all those years ago.
She turned Miss Crawley against us and made us poor,
she said.
But how can I be angry with the woman who helped me marry the best husband in the world?
Rawdon was also very polite and respectful to his brother, the new Sir Pit. He listened carefully to the plans he was making for the estate. Miss Briggs sent him letters about little Rawdon, and sometimes little Rawdon himself wrote a small note in his childish writing. Rawdon read the notes to Sir Pit and Lady Jane, and Sir Pit promised to pay for his education. Lady Jane gave Becky some money to buy him a present. Rawdon and Becky stayed at Queen's Crawley for several months. Becky thought it would be quite an easy life to be a rich man's wife, if only she had enough money to live that way all the time. Old Mr. Osborne had aged a lot since his son died, and he was never happy. He asked Miss Swartz to marry him, but she had refused. She had even laughed at him. His elder daughter, Maria, had married Frederick Bullock, and his younger daughter, Jane, stayed at home to look after him. She had as much money as she wanted, but it did not satisfy her. She was very unhappy. Maria seldom visited them because the Bullock family thought the Osbornes were not good enough for them. Maria and Frederick had a son, whom they named Frederick Augustus Howard Stanley Devereux Bullock, and old Mr. Osborne sent them a generous gift. Jane sometimes read about her sister in the papers when they described the important people who attended dinners and parties in the city. Jane's name was never in the papers. She had a very boring life. Every morning she had breakfast with her father, who was always angry and never spoke to her. During the day she annoyed the servants and tradesmen and visited some other unmarried women. They were all as unhappy as she was. Her father came home for dinner and only spoke to complain about the food. Jane rarely met a man under 60 years old, and the only bachelor she ever met was her doctor. Her father would not allow her to meet any bachelors at all. Her sister had more and more children with grander and grander names. Dobbin sisters, who knew Jane, sometimes visited Amelia. One day they took little George for a drive in their carriage, while Amelia wrote some letters. They took him to meet Jane, who cried and kissed him and gave him a gold watch. Amelia was worried when she heard about this. Jane, however, told her father that she had seen him and that he looked like his father. Old Mr. Osborne could not speak, but every part of his body shook. In India, Mrs. Major O'Dowd was now Lady Colonel O'Dowd, because her husband had been promoted and knighted after the war in Belgium. She enjoyed life in India, and when her sister-in-law Glorvina came to stay with her, she decided that she should marry Major Dobbin. Glorvina was a dark-haired, blue-eyed young lady who could ride a horse or play the piano as well as any girl in India. She agreed that Major Dobbin would be a good husband and spent as much time with him as possible. The other soldiers joked with Dobbin about her, and everybody thought that they would marry. Dobbin, however, laughed at the jokes and took no notice of Glorvina's hard work. There was only one woman in his mind, and that was Emilia. His love for her had not changed. One day he received a letter from Amelia, in which she congratulated him on his marriage. Dobbin was very annoyed at his sisters for telling Amelia what people in India were saying. He was very miserable that night and was even angry with Emilia as he lay in his bed.
Amelia, I have always loved you,
he thought.
I have done everything for you. Why can't you love me?
He avoided Glorvina after that. He did not want any more stories to go back to England. A few weeks later, he received a letter from his sister. She wrote that the young minister of the local church had asked Amelia to marry him. Dobbin was so upset that he asked for leave and set out for England immediately. Chapter 16. Christmas. Christmas was coming. Sir Pit came to London to see his lawyers and stayed at a hotel. Becky heard that he was there and insisted that he should stay with Rawdon and herself in their house. Becky cooked for him and always praised him. She gave him good food and wine, which all came from Lord Steyne's kitchen, but that was her secret. Sir Pit began to think that Lady Jane was a very ordinary woman when compared to his brother's wife. He allowed Becky to redecorate and refurnish the family's London house, where Miss Crawley had lived.
I wish you could get some money from him,
said Rawdon.
Raggles is asking for his rent, and we owe it to him. Tell him that everyone will be paid when Sir Pit finishes with the lawyers.
She did not know if Sir Pit would ever give them any money. However, she also knew that Raggles would believe it if they told him that Sir Pit would help them. Rawdon gave him a small amount of money and told him what Becky said, and Raggles was happy. Little Rawdon was almost 8 years old now. He had a horse, which young Lord Southdon gave him. He was fond of Miss Briggs and especially of his father. His mother did not like him and hardly spoke to him. One night he heard his mother singing for Lord Steyne. He came downstairs to listen at the door. When Becky saw him, she hit him and sent him away.
Why can't I hear her sing?
He asked the cook, who was his friend.
She never sings for me. Why does she sing for that bald man?
The cook had no answer. From that day, Becky and her son were enemies. Lord Steyne didn't like him either. If they met by accident, Lord Steyne would say something stupid to him, and young Rawdon would not answer. Becky, her husband, and her son went to Queen's Crawley at Christmas. She did not want to take young Rawdon with her, but Lady Jane had written and begged her to bring him.
He should meet his cousins,
she wrote. So young Rawdon came to Queen's Crawley for the first time in his life and met his cousins. At dinner on the first night, he sat next to his aunt Lady Jane.
I like having dinner here,
he told her.
Why?
She asked.
At home, I always have dinner in the kitchen with the servants.
Becky was talking to Sir Pit and did not hear what her son said. Sir Pit tried very hard to be a good baronet at Queen's Crawley. He was kind to the people in the village and friendly to his neighbors. He gave money to the church and the school. He talked to his farmers about their crops and the weather. He visited the bishop. Becky praised him about all these things. On Christmas Day, there was a big family gathering at Queen's Crawley. Reverend and Mrs. Bute Crawley, their son James, and their 4 daughters all came for dinner. Becky was very polite and kind to them all. Young Rawdon always sat with Lady Jane rather than his mother. He did not let Mrs. Bute's daughters kiss him, but he did allow Lady Jane to kiss him. Becky saw this and called him to her. She kissed him too. He looked at her. Then he said,
"You never kiss me at home, Mother."
All the ladies heard it. Rawdon went outside and found his father. He went to the stables with him to look at the horses. Then they went to a barn and hunted for rats. Rawdon was always happy when he was with his father. Lady Jane and Becky were not as friendly now as they had been when they first met. However, Sir Pit spent more and more time with Becky because he could talk to her about his plans for Queen's Crawley. She understood him and praised him while his wife did not. Christmas at the Sedleys was not as cheerful as it was at Queen's Crawley. Amelia gave almost all her small widow's pension to her parents. Joseph also sent money from India. Emilia sent George to school and helped him with his work. He learned grammar and geography and was a good student. All she hoped for was to see him become great and famous, as he deserved to be. She thought he was just like his father. She had forgotten all the bad things about her dead husband and made the good things better and better until he was almost perfect in her memory. Dobbin's sisters still came to take George for rides in their carriage. She was afraid because she knew that they took him to see Jane Osborne. One day he told her that he had seen his grandfather, old Mr. Osborne.
"He looked at me and shook a lot,"
he said. A few days later, Mr. Osborne sent her a letter. He offered to take his grandson and make him his heir in place of his dead father. He would give Amelia enough money to live comfortably. He would continue to pay even if she married again, but she must never come to visit her son. He would be allowed to visit her sometimes. She was very angry about this letter.
I will not marry again. I will not take money from my child. How does he dare to suggest it? I will not answer his letter,
she exclaimed to the lawyer who brought it to her. Then old Mr. Sedley began to lose even more money. He could not pay his bills. Emilia was going to buy new clothes for George at Christmas, but when she heard that her father had not received any money from Joseph in India, she gave all her money to her parents. She cried, and George cried even louder. He was looking forward to his new clothes and some new books for school. Emilia sold some of her clothes. When she came home with some new books for George, her mother saw them and was angry.
"Books?"
she shouted.
"We need bread. I sold my jewels so that we can eat, but you spend your money on books for your child. Joseph has forgotten his father. George could live with his grandfather. He could go to school in a carriage and wear a gold watch, yet your father has no money at all,"
she cried. Was she being selfish? Should she let George live with his grandfather? She didn't know what to do. Chapter 17. Mrs. Rawdon Crawley Meets the King. Becky was excited. It was the most important day in her life. Sir Pit, as a new member of Parliament, was going to meet the king. Lady Jane, Colonel Rawdon, and his wife were going with him. They would all meet the king. Lady Barracris and quite a few other ladies thought that it was terrible.
She is just a governess, the daughter of a drawing teacher, and a dancing girl,
they exclaimed.
I am the wife of a baronet's uncle,
said Mrs. Bute to her 4 ugly daughters.
But I would never dream of meeting the king.
They were all envious, of course, though they would never admit it. Becky dressed herself beautifully, using clothes that she had found in old Miss Crawley's house when she was redecorating it. She also wore some beautiful diamonds. She looked much richer than Lady Jane.
"Where did you get those diamonds?"
asked Rawdon. Rawdon was not very well dressed, but this only made his wife look even prettier. Becky told him that she had borrowed them from the jeweler, but this was a lie. Sir Pit had given her some of them without telling Lady Jane. Lord Steyne had also given her some, but she had never told her husband about them. She kept them hidden in a small desk that Amelia Sedley had given her many years ago. Becky met the king, who spoke to her very briefly. However, it was long enough for Becky to think that she was more important than anybody who had never met the king. Some of her friends were no longer good enough for her, and she stopped seeing them. Lady Steyne and her daughter-in-law, the Countess of Gaunt, came to visit her and invited her to have dinner with them. Becky was delighted. There were a lot of people in London who would have paid a year's income for such an invitation. When Lord Steyne next visited Becky, she told him that his wife and daughter had visited her.
"You want to be important?"
He laughed.
"You want to be a fine lady, but you can't do it. You have no money. You can't compete with people who have money."
But you will help us get a good position,
smiled Becky.
"All women are the same,"
replied the Lord.
"They all want what they cannot have. If they could get it, they would soon find out that it is not worth having. Would you like to own a palace like my Gaunt house? It is much more comfortable than your house. I asked my wife to invite you to dinner next week, but the ladies will treat you very badly, I'm sure."
Becky told him that she had borrowed money from Miss Briggs and did not have the money to repay it.
"I did not tell my husband,"
she said, and began to cry. Lord Steyne gave her the money to repay her debt. It was more than she needed, but she did not give any of it to Miss Briggs. She bought a new dress for Miss Briggs, and she was very thankful. She gave some money to Mr. Raggles and paid some of her other debts, but most of the money went into the little desk with the diamonds and the other things that she wanted to keep secret from her husband. Lady Steyne and Lady Gaunt had not wanted to invite Becky, but Lord Steyne made them do it. They decided to invite Lady Beracress as well as the Prince and Princess of Peterwaradin. They were not very friendly toward Becky when she and Rawdon came for dinner, but Becky was very polite to them. Then she discovered that the Prince of Peterwaradin could speak French. All the other ladies looked foolish when she spoke to him in French. After dinner, the ladies ignored Becky. Lady Steyne began to feel sorry for her and asked her to sing. Becky was pleased to agree. She sang some songs that Lady Steyne loved, and the remainder of the night was a triumph for Becky. Everybody came to the piano to hear her sing. The prince complimented Lady Steyne on having such a pretty and talented friend. Rawdon was very uncomfortable with all these important people and hardly spoke during that evening. Becky, however, was delighted and shone like a brilliant star. Poor Becky! She did not know that she would soon fall from the very high place and that all her efforts would be wasted. Her world would soon come crashing down. Chapter 18. Parents, Children, and Money. Mr. and Mrs. Sedley no longer received money from Joseph in India, and it made them very poor. Emilia worried about this and tried to find ways of earning an income. She painted some pictures, but nobody would buy them. She tried to find work as a governess, but nobody would employ her. She thought about marrying the young minister, but she saw George's picture on the wall of her room and was ashamed that she had even thought of it. She wrote to her brother in India, but she did not know that her father owed so much money that all her brother's money went straight to a moneylender in the city. She waited patiently for Joseph's reply. One day she told her father that she had written to Joseph. He told her the truth. Now she had no hope, and she knew what she had to do. Her son must go to his grandfather. He was her heart and her treasure. He was her joy, her hope, and her love. She felt that she could not live without him. She wrote to Miss Jane Osborne and told her that she would allow George to live with his grandfather, but she wished to see him as often as she liked. Miss Jane read the letter to her father.
"I knew she would give in,"
he exclaimed. He told his daughter to prepare his son George's room for his grandson.
His mother is never to come to this house, but you can send her some money, he said.
Miss Jane visited Amelia the next day and gave her some money, which Amelia immediately gave to her father. Amelia told George that he would go and live with his grandfather soon. He was more pleased than sad about this news, and Amelia was disappointed. Didn't he love his mother? He told his friends at school that he was going to be rich. When he said goodbye to his mother, he did not cry, although she did. He often came to visit her on his pony, wearing his expensive new clothes. She was always happy when she saw him, but she cried every night before she went to sleep. Who can measure how much a mother loves her child? Becky, on the other hand, was so busy going to important dinners and parties that she never thought about her son. When Lord Steyne offered to pay for him to go to a boarding school, she quickly agreed. Rawdon was proud that his son was going to a good school, although he felt ashamed that he could not pay for it. He was very lonely when his son was at school, and he felt secretly angry at Becky for letting him go. Lord Steyne, meanwhile, had a conversation with Miss Briggs and discovered that Becky had never given her the money she got from him. She told him that Rawdon was looking after her money. Lord Steyne believed that Becky was helping Rawdon to take money from him. He was not angry with Becky, but he was angry with Rawdon.
He is making her his helper, he thought.
He spoke to Becky about it. She did not want to lose such a good and rich friend, so she blamed Rawdon for making her do it. Lord Steyne asked her to dismiss her companion, Miss Briggs, telling her it would save money, and Becky agreed. When Sir Pit heard about this, he was very upset. He spoke to Rawdon and told him that he could not let his wife go out without a companion, but there was nothing that either he or Rawdon could do to stop Becky. The Prince of Peterwarden invited her to come to his house for dinner, and other very important people did the same. Becky shone brighter and brighter as she went higher and higher in society. She gave parties at her own house, and people read about them in the papers. Becky was proud of her success, although she was sometimes bored and wished she could be a dancer like her mother. Rawdon and Becky were in debt all the time. Their parties and dinners would cost a lot of money, but Becky had fruit and meat from Sir Pit and wine from Lord Steyne. They bought everything else on credit and never paid for it, but this sometimes led to problems that they did not mention to their friends. They were invited to a grand dinner dance at the Prince of Peterwarden's palace. Becky shone more brightly than ever and danced with the prince. He asked her to sit next to him at dinner, where she ate from golden plates, while all the other ladies had only silver plates. After the dinner, Becky went home in a carriage, but Rawdon decided to walk. Lord Steyne's friend, Mr. Wenham, walked with him. They had not walked far when 3 men took hold of Rawdon and told him to come with them. They were debt collectors. They were paid by a Mr. Nathan, to whom Rawdon owed some money. They would lock him up until he had paid him.
"Lend me some money, Wenham,"
said Rawdon, but Wenham said he had no money and walked away. Rawdon went with the debt collectors. This was not the first time that this had happened to him. He would write Becky a note. She would pay Nathan, and he would be able to go home. Chapter 19. Becky's world begins to crash. Rawdon sat in his room in the debt collector's house. He decided not to write to Becky until the next day, so that she could sleep. He went to bed and did not wake up until late the next morning. He had his breakfast and then wrote to Becky. He was not very worried. "Dear Becky, I hope you slept well. Don't be worried that I am not at home. I am at the debt collector's house. Please take one of my watches and sell it and pay Nathan his money. Please come to see me and bring me some clean clothes." Then he sat down to wait. He read the paper, smoked a cigar, drank some coffee, and talked to a friend who happened to be there. The day passed, but Becky did not come. It was not until the evening meal that a messenger came with a bag of clothes and a letter. It was beautifully written on pink paper.
My poor husband, I could not sleep because I was worried about you. I felt ill, but then I received your letter. I went straight to old Nathan and begged him to give you time to pay, but he would not listen. He demanded all his money, so I went home to get my jewels, but Lord Steyne and some others were there and wanted to talk about the party last night. They thought I sang beautifully. As soon as the others were gone, I begged Lord Steyne to lend me the money. He said he would send it to me in the morning. I will bring it to you then. I am in bed with a terrible headache.
Rawdon was terribly angry about this letter. She would not sell her jewels to help him. She left him locked up in the debt collector's house while she talked with her rich friends about the party. He had a sudden thought. Perhaps his wife wanted him to be locked up so that she could be alone with Lord Steyne. Perhaps she had even asked Nathan to do this. He was furious at the thought. He remembered that his brother and Lady Jane were at their London house. He went to his room and wrote them a letter. An hour later, Lady Jane came and paid the money he owed to Nathan, and he was free to go.
Pitt was at a dinner,
she explained,
so I brought the money myself.
Rawdon was very grateful and quickly walked home. It was 9 o'clock at night. He looked at the house. He remembered that Becky had written that she was in bed with a headache. Why were the lights in the drawing room on? He went in and heard her laughing. Why were there no servants in the house? Then he heard Becky singing, and he heard Lord Steyne's voice, shouting,
"Brava!"
Rawdon opened the door and went in. He saw a small table with dinner for 2 people. He saw Lord Steyne leaning over a couch. He saw his wife sitting on the couch, beautifully dressed and wearing all her diamonds. Lord Steyne was holding her hand and was about to kiss it. Becky jumped up.
I am innocent,
she exclaimed. Rawdon looked very angry, and Lord Steyne looked very angry too. He thought that Becky and Rawdon had planned this, and they would ask him for money to keep quiet.
"You are not innocent,"
Lord Steyne shouted.
"I have given you thousands of pounds, and I will not give you any more."
He tried to leave the room, but Rawdon jumped toward him and held him.
"You are a liar!"
he shouted, and hit him twice before throwing him bleeding to the floor. Rawdon looked at Becky.
"Take off those jewels,"
he told her. She did. He took one of them and threw it at Lord Steyne. It hit him on the head, and he wore the scar for the rest of his life. Then Rawdon took Becky to her room and made her open her desk. He found all the money that Lord Steyne had given her.
"I will give it back to Lord Steyne,"
he said.
I am innocent,
repeated Becky. He took the money and left her without another word, and she knew that he would never return. It was already morning when Rawdon arrived at his brother's house. When Sir Pit saw him in his dirty clothes and his hair in a mess, he was worried.
"What are you doing? Why aren't you at home?"
he asked.
"I hope you don't want money. I can't give you any more."
"It's not the money. It's the boy. My marriage is over now, and if it weren't for the boy, I would have killed myself and Lord Steyne this morning. Will you look after him and be his friend?"
Sir Pit nodded and they shook hands.
"I will,"
he said. Rawdon gave him some of the money that he had found in Becky's desk. Then he went to Gaunt House, where Lord Steyne lived, and arranged to meet him for a duel. He met an old friend called Captain McMurdo and told him what had happened. McMurdo agreed to help him in the duel. Becky did not wake up until the afternoon after Rawdon's departure. She called out to her maid, but there was no answer. The maid had left, taking some of Becky's beautiful jewels with her. Becky went downstairs, where she found the servants drinking wine and eating cakes with Mrs. Raggles. None of them would listen to Becky. They told her to pay their wages.
How dare you?
Shouted Becky.
When Colonel Crawley comes home,
They all laughed at her and told her that he was not coming home. Mr. Raggles sat in a corner crying because they had not paid the rent for a year.
You've ruined me,
he cried.
I will pay you tomorrow,
shouted Becky.
Colonel Crawley has a new and well-paid position, but he took all our money with him when he left this morning. Let me go out and find him.
They were all surprised at this statement. Becky left the house and walked to Sir Pitt's house.
I still have one chance,
she said to herself. Chapter 20. Dobbin returns to England. Sir Pit was very surprised to see Becky at his house and didn't know what to say. She told him that Lord Steyne had found a position for Rawdon and that he was to be governor of Coventry Island with a good income.
It's in today's newspaper,
she added.
But we did not tell Rawdon because we wanted to surprise him.
Sir Pit looked in the newspaper and found that it was true. When Lady Jane saw Becky, she was very angry and did not believe that she was innocent at all. However, Sir Pit promised that he would try to find Rawdon and convince him that his wife was innocent. By now, other people had also seen the news in the papers, and it was not long before somebody told Rawdon, who was more than surprised and didn't know what to think. Lord Steyne's friend, Mr. Wayman, found him and talked to him and Captain McMurdo about the duel. He convinced Captain McMurdo that Lord Steyne was innocent. Rawdon was not convinced, but the duel was cancelled. He still believed that Becky was guilty, but at last he accepted his new position and left the country. He sent money to his wife and to his brother and wrote often to his son. Becky disappeared, and she did not try to see her son. Sir Pit looked after him, and young Rawdon was very happy when they invited him to live at Queen's Crawley. Amelia never stopped thinking about her son and kept a picture of him next to the picture of his father. Sometimes his Aunt Jane Osborne took him to see his mother, who was always happy to see him. She made some shirts for him, but when Jane saw them, she gave them to the servants and bought George some very expensive ones instead. Old Mr. Osborne had become quite rich, and he was able to give his grandson even more money than he had given his son. He was very proud of his grandson. He gave him the best pony that money could buy and paid for a very good education. He told all his friends about George and the wonderful things he did. George, however, soon realized that he was more clever than his grandfather and secretly laughed at him. George was a happy boy who often went to the theater and enjoyed his school lessons. A few months later, Amelia's mother became ill and died so that Emilia had nobody to care for except her father. He had lost everything, and now he had lost his wife. Little George was allowed to go to the funeral, but he was annoyed because he really wanted to go to the theater that afternoon. One day, George was sitting in his classroom when a carriage arrived, and two men stepped out of it. They came into the school and asked for George Osborne.
"Do you know who we are?"
asked one of the men.
I don't know who this man is, but I think you must be Major Dobbin,
answered George.
My mother often talks about you.
Major Dobbin had left for England as soon as Colonel O'Dowd gave him permission. He went to Madras, but there he became ill and lay in bed for a very long time. He recovered and got sick again. He lost a lot of weight, and it was a long time before the doctor would let him get on a ship for England. He was very surprised when he found that Joseph Sedley was also a passenger on the ship, and the two men often talked to each other on the way to England. Joseph had become quite rich and no longer needed to work in India, so he had decided to go back to England and live there. Joseph told Major Dobbin some very important news. His sister Emilia was not married. This was the best medicine that Major Dobbin could have, and his health improved rapidly after that. When the ship arrived in Southampton, Major Dobbin went to London as soon as he could. He did not stop along the way, but Joseph, who was never in a hurry, stopped at every eating and drinking place and traveled slowly. As soon as Dobbin arrived in London and got a room at a hotel, he went to the Sedleys' house without seeing his parents or sisters first. Emilia was out walking with her father, and the servants told him about Mrs. Sedley's death and about George going to live with his grandfather Osborne. When Amelia and her father returned home, they were very pleased to see the Major, and even more excited when he told them that Joseph was also on his way and would arrive soon. Amelia did not know whether Dobbin was married or not, and she did not dare to ask him. She told him all about her wonderful son.
He is just like his father,
she said. That night, while Polly, her maid, was helping Amelia prepare for bed, the two young ladies talked about Major Dobbin.
I am sure that he loves you,
said Polly.
And he never mentioned a wife. He could not stop looking at you all evening.
I cannot think of marrying again when I have been married to such a man as George was,
replied Amelia.
Please don't speak about it again.
Chapter 21. The Old Piano. Amelia and her father were up early the next morning and prepared the house for Joseph's arrival. However, Joseph had stopped on the way to London. He sent them a letter to say that he would not arrive until the next day because he was tired and had a headache. He said that he looked forward to seeing his father and mother. He didn't know that his mother had died. He bought some new clothes and hired a servant before continuing his journey to London. When he arrived, he was very happy to see his father and his sister, but very sad that his mother had died. He saw that they were very poor and promised them that they would never be poor again. He promised to buy a house where they would all live together. The Major helped him to find a suitable house, and a few weeks later, Amelia and her father moved to their new home. Amelia was not sad to leave her old home because she had been very unhappy there. She gave all her furniture to the landlady and her servant and took only the pictures of her dead husband and her son and the small old piano to her new home.
I'm glad you want to keep the old piano,
said Major Dobbin.
I was afraid you did not care about it any longer.
It is the most precious thing I own,
she answered. Dobbin was very excited when he heard this because he had bought the piano and given it to her. He thought that she loved him.
Is that really true?
He asked, trembling. He was ready to ask her to marry him.
Of course,
she said.
George gave it to me.
I didn't know,
he said sadly. He looked so sad that Amelia guessed the truth. George had not given her the piano. She apologized to the Major and thanked him.
Yes, it was I who bought it for you,
he replied.
I loved you then, and I love you still. I have always loved you and wanted what is best for you. I think about you all the time, but you do not care whether I am in England or in India. I know that you cannot love me.
George is my husband and will always be my husband,
she cried.
But please stay in England and be a friend for me and my son.
Dobbin agreed, of course, and often went to visit Amelia in her new home. George frequently told his mother how much he liked the Major. However, he did not like his Uncle Joseph very much. Joseph spent most of his time talking to his old friends from India. Sometimes he invited some of them to come for dinner, where they all enjoyed meeting and talking to Amelia. Life was much more pleasant for Amelia and her father now, but at last Mr. Sedley became ill, and Amelia looked after him lovingly until he died. Old Mr. Osborne was not sad when Sedley died.
I have worked harder than him,
he told George.
And although he was once richer than me, he has died a poor man. I hope you have learned from his mistakes.
Then he discovered that Major Dobbin had been helping Mr. Sedley and Amelia by giving them money, and spoke to the Major about it.
I know that I encouraged them to marry,
said Dobbin.
So I felt that I should help her when she had no money.
The two men began to see each other more often, and the old man even invited Dobbin for dinner. After dinner, Dobbin spoke to Mr. Osborne about Amelia.
I wish you could be friends,
he said.
She took your son away from you, I know, but she gave you hers. You loved your son very much, and she loves her son even more.
Old Mr. Osborne had never thought about that, and decided to meet with Amelia. He changed his will and made a date for the meeting. However, before it could take place, he became ill, and 4 days later, he died. Half of his money was left to his grandson George, and the other half was divided between his two daughters. He even left a generous amount for Amelia and said that she was to look after her son again. Emilia was delighted, and when she discovered that he had also given Major Dobbin some money because he had cared for my dear son's widow, she was very grateful to Dobbin. Gratitude, however, is not love, and Dobbin knew this very well. Now that Amelia had some money, some of her old friends came to visit her again, including her sister-in-law, Mrs. Fred Bullock, who thought it was her duty to make Amelia a lady. Amelia did not enjoy many of these visits and was very happy when Dobbin suggested that they all go on an overseas vacation. Chapter 22. George Osborne meets Becky Sharp. Joseph and his sister Amelia, her son George, and Dobbin took a steamer to Rotterdam. Lord and Lady Baracris were also on the steamer, and Joseph enjoyed talking to them. When they arrived in Rotterdam, they took another steamer up the river to Cologne. Amelia was very happy. Dobbin carried her chair and sketchbook so that she could draw, and he always admired her pictures. They stayed in Cologne for a long time. They enjoyed the dinners and the operas in the evenings, where Amelia heard music by Mozart for the first time. They went to Pumpernickel, where Pit Crawley had once worked as a diplomat. They met a lord who lived there, and he invited them to stay longer. Joseph was happy to meet a lord, and he decided they would stay in Pumpernickel for 3 months. Many important people of the area came to visit them, and they even met the prince. Joseph loved meeting all these important people. Emilia enjoyed the operas and her drawing, and Dobbin enjoyed seeing Amelia happy. George enjoyed the food and began to learn the language. It was a very happy time for all of them. While they were in Pumpernickel, there was a large festival to celebrate the marriage of one of the princesses who lived there. People came from all over Europe and England. There were dinners and parties and operas every evening. During the festival, there was also a lot of gambling, and it was while young George was watching this that he saw Becky Crawley. Of course, he did not know who she was, but she saw him watching her and asked him to help her by choosing a number.
"What's your name?"
she asked.
"My name is Osborne,"
he replied. He was thinking that he might like to gamble too, but Dobbin and his uncle arrived. They did not see Becky, and Dobbin took George away. He made the boy promise that he would never gamble, telling him about the problems it had given his father. Joseph, however, stayed to gamble for a while and was very surprised when Becky came and talked to him. When Becky's husband, Rawdon Crawley, hit Lord Steyne, left his wife, and accepted the position of governor of Coventry Island, Becky did not know what to do. She stayed in London for a while and tried to see Sir Pit so that she could ask him to help her, but Lady Jane would not let Sir Pit see her. She wrote him a letter, but he would not reply. Rawdon sent her some money so that she was able to live, but it was not a large amount, and she could not live as well as she did when she lived with her husband. Nobody would lend her money. Her son went to live at Queen's Crawley with his aunt and uncle, and she did not visit him or even write to him there until Sir Pitt's own son died and young Rawdon became the heir of Queen's Crawley. When she realized that her son would be a baronet one day, she wrote him a letter and told him how much she loved him. He wrote back to her and told her that he considered Lady Jane to be his mother. Becky went to Boulogne, where she went to dinners and parties, and gave her own parties as well. Other people from London arrived there, and soon everybody knew that she was a married woman with no husband and very little money, and they stopped inviting her to their dinners. The landlord of the hotel asked her to leave. She was very lonely. She worked hard to win back some respect. She went to church and helped poor people. She made drawings and sold them, giving the money to the missionaries in Africa. However, she was not successful, as important people still avoided her and would not invite her to their parties. She sometimes made friends with them for a short time. She told one lady that her son was the same age as her Rawdon and looked just like him. She cried because she had lost her son and was not allowed to see him. The lady felt sorry for her and became her friend, but soon somebody told her that young Rawdon was 5 years older than her son and did not look like him at all. That was the end of the short friendship. Finally, she left Boulogne and traveled to other parts of Europe. She always made friends with the English people she found there, but she soon left again for another city. She made her way to Paris, but she still owed money to people there, and she soon had to leave again. This time she went to Brussels and found some of Rawdon's old gambling friends. By the time she left Brussels, she owed 3 months' rent to her landlady. She went from one city to another, and her friends became less and less respectable. She traveled through Germany, Italy, and Switzerland. Sometimes she was rich, and sometimes she was poor. When she was rich, she gave parties and gambled, and when she was poor, she gave concerts and music lessons. She liked this way of living and found it exciting. Once, when she had just arrived in Rome, she was invited to a very important ball, and there she saw Lord Steyne. She remembered how wonderful it was when he was her friend, and they used to dine together several times every week. Suddenly he saw her, and she bowed to him. He stared at her with his mouth open, and she quickly moved away. The next day she received a warning from Lord Steyne's friend.
The weather in Rome is very dangerous. If you do not leave, you will get sick and die.
Becky laughed, but then she thought it might be safer if she went somewhere else. Chapter 23. Amelia decides to help Becky. The day after Joseph met Becky in Pumpernickel, he was out of bed early and went to the Elephant Hotel. He climbed up the stairs to Becky's room. 2 young men were knocking on her door and joking with her. She told them to go away because she was expecting a visit from her grandfather. When they saw him, they laughed at him and ran away. Becky opened the door and let him into her room. Joseph had never been in such a room before. Her clothes were scattered over the bed and the floor, and a very cheap candle stood on the table. She told Joseph that she was used to much better living, but she had experienced a lot of bad luck, and that she had many enemies. Then she told him that he was the first man that she had ever thought of marrying, and that she still liked him a lot.
I am a married woman, and I did the best I could for my husband. That was my duty, but sometimes it was difficult.
She began to cry.
They took my little boy away from me,
she sobbed. By the time Joseph left the room, Becky had convinced him that she had been unlucky, and he was trying to think of ways in which he could help her. He talked to Dobbin about it, but Dobbin warned Joseph that Becky brought trouble wherever she went.
Why should we help her? Why is she here? Why is she alone?
He asked. They decided to let Amelia decide. Dobbin knew that Amelia did not like Becky because of the way that she had behaved with George, so he felt sure that she would agree with him. As soon as Amelia realized that Joseph wanted her to visit Becky, she began to cry.
Please, don't make me see her,
she sobbed.
But she doesn't have a friend in the world,
said Joseph.
And she thought that she could trust you to help her. She thinks she will die if you don't help. She has a little boy about the same age as your George. Her husband's brother took him away from her. The little boy called out for his mother, but they would not let him go.
Emilia jumped up from her chair.
Let us go and see her immediately,
she cried. She got her coat and hat, and Dobbin knew that he could not stop her. Becky was looking out of the window of her room and saw them coming. She prepared the room quickly and pretended to be surprised to see them when she opened the door. Amelia hugged and kissed her while Dobbin stood and watched.
Poor Becky,
exclaimed Amelia.
They took your darling child from you. I know how terrible it is to lose a son, and I feel very sorry for you. I hope that yours will come back to you, as mine has come back to me."
Becky felt ashamed of telling Joseph lies about her son, but she could not tell Amelia the truth.
"It was terrible when they took him away, and I thought I would die."
When Amelia asked her about her son, she had to tell more lies because she did not know anything about him. She did not even know how old he was. She told Amelia that Rawdon had treated her badly and that she had only stayed with him because of her son. Finally, Rawdon had forced her to flee, leaving her son behind. Amelia believed every word of these lies and felt sorry for Becky. While the two old friends were talking, Dobbin went downstairs and waited. There he heard two young men talking about Becky. One of them said that she was selling tickets for a concert, but that they should not buy any. She had sold tickets for concerts in other towns and then left the town without giving the concert.
"She is still playing her tricks,"
Dobbin said to himself. He remembered how Becky had tried to get Joseph to marry her, and how he and George Osborne had laughed about it later. He also remembered that George himself had become too friendly with her in Brussels.
"I have been foolish with a woman,"
George had told him on the day that he died.
"I hope that Amelia will never know about it if I die."
As he was thinking about this, Emilia came downstairs and wanted to see her brother immediately.
"Well?"
asked Joseph when they found him.
"Oh, that poor woman, how she has suffered!"
exclaimed Amelia.
"She can have the maid's room."
Dobbin jumped up from his chair.
"You are not going to have her stay in the house with you, are you?"
"Of course we are,"
answered Amelia.
"That poor woman has suffered enough. They took her child away from her, and now she is forced to give singing lessons to get her bread. Of course we will have her here, and we will look after her."
"Please don't do it,"
replied the Major. Amelia was surprised.
"You are usually so kind and good. Why will you refuse to help this poor woman who is one of my oldest friends?"
Dobbin was angry now and said,
"She was not always your friend, Amelia."
Now Amelia was angry too, because she knew what he meant. She ran to her own room and shut the door. She looked at her picture of George.
"It was cruel of him to remind me of that,"
she said to the picture. All the pain of those terrible days in Brussels returned, and she could hardly bear to look at the picture. Chapter 24. Becky gives Amelia a present. Poor Dobbin! How long had he loved Amelia, and for how many years had he waited patiently for her to love him in return? How many times had he helped her and looked after her without even telling her? Now it was all ruined by one sentence.
"She was not always your friend, Amelia."
Nevertheless, he continued to argue with Joseph and told him not to let Becky into the house. Joseph, however, would not listen.
"I don't need anybody to tell me what to do,"
he said.
"I can decide for myself, and I have decided to help her and have her in the house."
When Becky arrived at the house with her baggage, Amelia hugged and kissed her again and glared at poor Dobbin, who went out for dinner. Young George came home, and Amelia introduced him to Becky.
"This is my son,"
she said, and her eyes said,
"Have you seen anything so beautiful in the whole world?" "He is beautiful,"
said Becky.
"He reminds me of—"
She could not finish the sentence, but Amelia knew what she meant and felt sorry for her again. Becky was very upset, but it did not stop her from eating a very good dinner. Dobbin had his dinner with some army friends, and they soon told him the truth about Becky Crawley. The Major was horrified. The next morning he sent a note to Amelia, asking to see her immediately. However, she sent a note to say that she was ill and would not see anybody. Finally, in the afternoon, she agreed to see him. Becky was in the room too and tried to be friendly with him, but he told her that he was not her friend. He told Amelia that Becky was not a good person to have in the house or to be her friend, but he did not say any of the things that his army friends had told him. Amelia and Becky did not want to listen and were about to leave when he asked Amelia if he could speak to her alone.
I will never forgive you for what you said yesterday,
exclaimed Amelia.
My husband was the best man that ever lived, and you insulted him.
What happened yesterday is only an excuse,
said Dobbin softly.
I know you, and I love you. I know that you are holding on to a memory, and that because you love the memory, you cannot love a real person like me. You are not worthy of the love I have given you. I was a fool, and I will stop. You are a good person, and you will always be a friend. But I cannot wait for you to love me any longer. Goodbye, Amelia.
Amelia stood silently as he declared his independence. She did not want to marry him, but she did want to keep him. She would not give him anything, but wanted him to give her everything.
Are you going away then?
I went away once before, and I came back after 12 years. I have wasted enough of my life waiting for you, and I will say goodbye.
Becky had listened at the door and heard every word of the conversation. Later that afternoon, during dinner, George saw the servants getting Dobbin's carriage and baggage ready.
Is Dobbin going somewhere?
He asked his mother.
He is going on a journey,
she replied. She could not eat her dinner.
When is he coming back?
He is not coming back.
George was very upset and rushed out to see him. As he went, Becky gave him a note to give to Dobbin. George put his arms around Dobbin's neck and asked him lots of questions. He gave him Becky's note, but Dobbin read it and tore it up. That night, George cried in his bed. Dobbin was gone, but Emilia had the picture of her dead husband for comfort. Becky made herself comfortable with Emilia and Joseph. Joseph did whatever she asked him to do and drove her around in his carriage. He even had some parties for her and enjoyed being Becky's benefactor. Becky began to shine again, but poor Amelia was sadder and lonelier than she had ever been in her life. She became pale and ill, and Becky ran the house. Amelia went for walks with her son and told him about Major Dobbin and all the things he had done for her in the past. She said he was the best and kindest man alive. Joseph read in the London papers that Dobbin had become a lieutenant colonel and had joined his regiment. George and Dobbin wrote to each other frequently, and George told his mother what Dobbin was doing and where he was. She became more and more sorry that she had thrown away such a treasure as Dobbin. At the end of June, Joseph, Emilia, George, and Becky went to Ostend for a while. Becky was worried when she met some of her old friends who wanted her to drink and gamble and get some money from Joseph for them. One of them began to take an interest in Amelia, which frightened Amelia very much. She was very unhappy. At last she sat down and wrote a letter. She did not tell anybody about this letter and secretly sent it to England. Becky could see that Amelia was sad and afraid.
She should marry Dobbin,
she told herself.
And I will fix it tonight. You must go away from here,
she told Amelia.
The men in this town are not good men, and you should not talk to them because they will insult you. You should marry Dobbin. I saw how he loved you, but you would take no notice of him. I tried,
cried Amelia.
But I could not forget him.
She looked at the picture of George.
Him,
exclaimed Becky.
That selfish man. He had no manners, no brain, and no heart. Your Dobbin is 100 times better. George was ready to leave you, but Dobbin persuaded him to stay. That's not true. Look at this,
said Becky.
He gave me this on the day that he went to the battle.
Amelia looked at the letter that her husband had put in Becky's flowers at the dance in Brussels. She read it and wept. In it, he asked Becky to run away with him.
You should write Dobbin a letter immediately,
she told Amelia.
I wrote to him this morning,
cried Amelia. They looked at each other for a moment and then began to laugh and hug and kiss. A few days later, a steamer came into Ostend and Dobbin was on it. Amelia and George were waiting. When they saw each other, they hugged each other, and Amelia made Dobbin promise that he would never leave again. It did not take long to arrange a wedding, and soon they were married. Only Joseph and George were at the wedding because Becky had gone to Brussels with her old friends. Colonel Dobbin left the army and bought some land near Queen's Crawley, where their daughter Jane Dobbin was born and where Mrs. Rawdon Crawley's name was never heard. Becky lived in Brussels, where she remained friends with Joseph and happily spent all his money.
Playlet. Vanity Fair.
It's a party. The room is filled with people. Some of them are standing, holding drinks and talking to each other. Others are dancing. Others are sitting at tables gambling. Others are watching the dancing or the gambling. Dobbin is talking with a group of men. General Tufto is talking to another group of men. He is holding some flowers. Becky and Rawdon arrive at the same time as George and Amelia, and they all go in. They move through the party and lots of people say hello to Becky or to George.
Look, there's General Tufto. I think he saw me. I'd better go and say hello. I wonder why he has those flowers.
Yes, you go and say hello to the General, dear. I think I will join the tables. Are you coming, George? You might win back some of the money I won from you yesterday.
Yes, go on, George. Your luck must change soon.
Yes, of course. I'll win it all back one day. You just watch. You've just been lucky so far. Rawdon and George walk toward the gambling table without looking back at Amelia.
Will you be all right, dear? There's an empty chair there for you to sit on if you like.
Amelia looks at the chair as a man sees Becky. He says, "Hello, Mrs. Crawley." He gives her a drink and walks with her toward the General. Amelia looks at George walking away from her and smiles sadly.
Yes, go on, George. Be careful and have a good time, won't you? I'll wait here.
George does not hear her and does not look back. Amelia sits on the chair. She watches the people dancing. Becky is talking to the General. We can't hear what they are saying, but we can hear the General laugh, and then he gives her the flowers. Other men come and join in the conversation. George comes too, leaving Rawdon at the gambling table. Dobbin has seen Amelia and is watching her as he talks with his group of men. After a few moments, Becky says something which makes her whole group laugh, and she and George come back toward Amelia. Becky is carrying the flowers.
Oh, there you are, Amelia. Those generals are such funny men, aren't they, George?
Yes, they are.
That naughty Rawdon has gone off gambling and left me, and I feel like dancing. You don't mind if I dance with your husband, do you, Amelia? No, of course not. If I give you the flowers to hold, will you look after them for me while I dance? Yes, I suppose so. Thanks, you are a sweetheart. George is a lucky man.
Becky gives Amelia the flowers and she and George join in the dancing. Amelia watches them. Dobbin watches Amelia. He goes to George and Becky and says something to George. We can't hear it because of the music, but we hear George laugh and see him shake his head. Becky laughs too. Dobbin goes to Amelia. She does not see him coming because she is watching George and Becky dance.
Hello, Amelia.
Oh, hello, Dobbin. Are you here too?
Yes, I am. I was talking to some of the regiment.
Oh.
George comes back to Amelia. Becky wants to show her flowers to some men.
Oh.
Amelia gives the flowers back to George. I say, Dobbin, thanks for looking after Amelia. Have you got a piece of paper and a pen? Dobbin takes a piece of paper and a pen out of his pocket and gives them to George. Thanks, old friend. George goes to a table and writes something on the piece of paper. Then he puts the paper in the flowers and the pen in his pocket. He goes back to Becky. He gives her the flowers and she sees the note. She looks at him and he winks at her. She winks at him. George goes to the gambling table and begins to gamble.
Amelia?
Yes, Dobbin.
Amelia, would you like to dance?
That's very kind, thank you, Dobbin. But I am not feeling well.
Shall I ask George to take you home?
I think he would rather stay here. Perhaps you could take me home?
Yes, of course I will.
Dobbin helps Amelia out of the chair and they walk out of the party together. Neither Becky nor George take any notice. I win! Oh, I'm a winner tonight!
Seems like your luck has changed at last.
That's for sure. It has really changed. I'm a big winner tonight. I think I deserve a drink.
George goes to the bar and gets a drink. He sees Amelia's empty chair and shrugs his shoulders. He holds up his drink to the empty chair.
Hey, little wife, I'm a winner tonight.
Dobbin comes back in alone and goes to talk to the general. The general is looking very serious. Becky is still talking to some other men, holding her flowers. The general says something to Dobbin, who quickly looks around the room for George. When he sees him, he goes straight to him.
George! George!
George is holding a drink in one hand and a lot of money in the other hand.
Dobbin, old friend, did I tell you that I am a big winner tonight?
Listen, George, forget all that.
How can I forget it? I'm not often a big winner.
George, listen. Napoleon's army has crossed the border into Belgium. Our regiment will go to fight 3 hours from now.
In 3 hours? From now? You mean?
Yes, in 3 hours. Go home to Emilia. She is not feeling well. I just took her home.
Amelia. Oh, that sweet, wonderful wife. Oh, Dobbin, what have I done? I've been stupid. I must go to Emilia.
George runs out of the room, closely followed by Dobbin.